Kia ora koutou. Nothing like a room full of teachers to be on time and in their seats and in the front rows and engaged. Yeah, great audience to have. I'm Amanda Wolf. It is my complete pleasure to be here chairing this day. We've got some fantastic speakers and a little bit of food lined up for you. So we'll just kick off. Just to welcome you to the Pipatia campus of Te Herenga Waka. Information for the access. Great. The Dean of the Faculty of Business and Government asked me to create a day around the theme of preparing students for university in an AI world. And so what I've done is just to, by way of kicking us off, is just to break those three parts down a bit. The first bit, when I think of preparing students in this era, I see it as having four component parts. There's the knowledge content, the foundations and the fundamentals that we usually think of going along with teaching and learning. But increasingly, I'm focusing on the learning process. It's all good, well and good to have some content in your head, but actually being able to get and find what you need when you need it is increasingly important. And along with that is the awareness of our students of themselves and the contexts in which they live and work and are moving into. We're really excited here at the university to be taking a couple of really fresh areas of focus on what's coming in, what we're doing while we're here, and what's going out again. The transition into university are really important here and at all universities, where we are really concentrating on what actually we need to do to help all our learners be ready for what's coming next. A lot of that philosophy has been built into our refreshed Bachelor of Commerce degree, which we are piloting as we speak this summer, and will be launched fully in 2025 with a reconfigured core program. We've got a brochure in your bags to explain more about that. And then, of course, the transitions out of university with what I prefer to call a world-ready graduate as opposed to a work-ready graduate. And we've set some really ambitious graduate attributes for these students as they leave our university. And actually, we've been reminded to keep focused on these by the other universities who've approved our design of this new degree. So we really want our graduates to not only be able to find, analyze data and make sense of it, but we want them to be able to incorporate Te Tiriti in everything they do in their work and their investigations, to really critique the interrelationships between business and government, taking advantage of our location here in Wellington. And actually, when you think about it, business in the absence of awareness of government is going to be a restricted perspective. And similarly, government is heavily in the, I was going to say the business of helping business, but you know what I mean. Government is really involved in the infrastructure of our economy and our society. So that's a really important and potentially unique factor of what we're producing in our degree. And we've got a whole bunch more graduate attributes that we're interested in. I won't read them all, but really preparing people to make a positive social impact, to apply critical and creative thinking, collaborate, communicate, and all of those sorts of things. In the context of the transition of learners into university, we've undergone a fairly lengthy series of consultations internally using amazing resources from other universities who've also focused on this and really thought about what are our first year learning principles. This is a draft. but courtesy of the owners of this process, they've encouraged me actually to share it with you, and we welcome any feedback on this. And I won't go through each of these sections in detail, but we're trying to pick out the non-knowledge content focus of university, to really focus on the whole person, to take the time to welcome them in, make them feel part of this huge place by finding where they fit, where they belong, finding their people, finding their identity groups, guiding them, welcoming them. Then there is how we focus on getting the content that we are introducing in that first year suited to the transition pedagogy theories, so that we're relevant, so that we're scaffolding, so that it's developmental, so that right from the start, we're engaging learners in reflecting on what's happening. So this isn't the old model of they come in, a line of people that we see passing through the years, we dump stuff into them and out they go the other end. It's a much more engaged and interactive process. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that more specifically in the later part of the program. And of course, we're really taking our pastoral code of conduct obligations seriously in being proactive in well-being and support instead of reactive. The refreshed Bachelor of Commerce degree has 2 100-level courses, which is a shift from 7 in previous years. And we then staircase into 2 at 200 level and a capstone at 300 level. The distinguishing features of the BCom, as I mentioned already, the integration of business and government, but we also focus on grand challenges so that students are able to think about business disciplines in the context of something they're passionate about, be it climate change or plastic waste or cost of living or whatever it is, to really enliven our subjects and to help them find the ones that are of most interest to them, and maybe discover complementary areas of study so that they become more rounded graduates when they come out. Alongside this, we offer tools for study and work in business and government. This is not a remedial course. This is actually helping them step up from what they already have in terms of study and work skills and tools into an enriched environment, which we then intersect with what they're learning in the Grand Challenges course. So we're more than happy to chat with you further about this or follow up with us at any time. And finally, we've got in the AI world, and we'll be focusing on that quite a bit today, but just to say that obviously we've got the outward looking features of moving into a changed environment. So how is AI going to change the environment of work that our students are moving into? Therefore, within our catchment in the university, how are we helping to develop those new competencies? And then through that process, ensuring that the human, our learners, are well equipped to make sound decisions in that AI world. So getting that balance between the human and the machine happening is one of our main objectives. Wastage of my time babbling up here, I would like to introduce my colleague, Maja Krtalić from the School of Information Management. Maja is doing some absolutely amazing work, and it's really a delight to welcome her here to share some of her thoughts about, as it says here, information in daily life, business, government, and society. And for our folks joining us online, if you have any questions for any of us, we are monitoring the chat, and we will try and get to as many of those as we can or follow up as need be. Folks in the room, again, hopefully we'll have some time for you to interact with your questions and comments. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the audience in front of me and to the people online. It is my pleasure to speak to you. I usually speak either in front of the group of students that are studying information-related topics or a group of experts who are investigating and researching information-related topics. So you are my first teacher's audience. I'm very honored to speak in front of you. As I was preparing for this lecture, I wondered what on earth made me suggest such a huge and complex topic, such as information in daily life, business, government, and society. So just a disclaimer, I cannot possibly exhaust or discuss all the complexities of the topic, but I hope to raise some of the challenges we are all facing and maybe spark some discussions that you might take and then develop further among yourselves or with your students. So my name is Maja Krtalić. I'm an associate professor in the School of Information Management, and I teach and research issues related to information management, but also information behavior, information experiences. So I take this broader holistic view of how information impacts our lives. And I have been in academia for the past 20 years studying information science, which was a fascinating journey because it enabled me to observe not just my own interaction with information, but also how information world is changing, how technology is influencing the way we communicate, the way we learn, the way we work, the way we create legacies for the future. So through that lens, I will talk about information and information world, recognizing that AI is just a part of that world, significant part, and we are definitely facing a paradigm shift. But still, information world that has been complex and complicated for many decades. And as time goes by, and I had a conversation with James, our student who will talk later, how it will be interesting to see over time what aspects of AI will become normalized over the years. So something that we still find challenging and questionable, what will become normalized, what will become part of our normal daily routine, what parts we will just discard, and what new challenges will emerge. So when we talk about preparing students for university in an AI world, for me, it is also preparing students to be able to apply and live information ready in today's world. So through that lens, I will talk about information in daily life, business, government, and society. But before I start, I would just like you to take a minute and think about from the moment you woke up this morning. I won't ask you to share that with me, so just think about for yourself. What were some of the pressing information needs you had? How did you go about them? What were some of the information systems, apps, devices you used? And what were some of the challenges and complexities or feelings that accompanied that interaction with information and systems you had today? So just maybe 30 seconds for you to gather your thoughts. There's quite a lot of murmur in the room. I hope the audience online is considering this as well. So if you had what we can call a typical information day, you probably woke up and relatively soon grabbed your phone, either to check the weather forecast, either to check messages from your family or friends, either to check, hopefully not your work emails that early in the morning, or to maybe do some housekeeping activities, paying the bills, ordering food, or any other activity. Maybe you also did not feel ready to be overloaded with information. So you stayed away from news, you stayed away from opening work emails, you did not want Google and other services to suggest anything for you today. So maybe you wanted to safeguard that first hour of your day for some other activities for yourself or with your families. Whatever you did, it included interaction with information. Then if you took the train or drove to the city or even walked, you were probably surrounded by information at every corner, either the posters, billboards, catching conversations from people passing you by, or anything else that came from the environment. So maybe awareness of the weather today, nature, clouds, trees, seasons, but also what may have informed you are probably the memories information triggered. So maybe you remembered a November day 10 years ago. Maybe, like myself, you are not from New Zealand, so November is always time when the first snow starts falling. So maybe you had those embedded information-related memories. So your environment was full of information that you gathered through various senses. So not just through physical or digital items or objects, as we like to call them. All that is something we call the red thread of information. This is the concept information scholars often use to describe that omnipresent information thread that weaves through the structure, to the fabric of our lives, that connects devices, environments, infrastructure, thoughts, cognitive aspects, communication with other people. So the red thread that actually goes through our lives and connects all these examples that I talked about today. But something to keep in mind here, and I will discuss this presence of the red thread of information in our life in more details. Something to keep in mind is that information can't be easily defined. I won't even go into the discussion, what is data and what is information and what is knowledge, because if you get a group of people who love and study information, it is inevitable that they will fight about it in about 30 seconds. But how we perceive and define information can be quite different from one person to another. So just keep that in mind as we go through the following points. I also forgot to mention, if you have any questions or examples of your own, write them down, and I won't talk at you for 45 minutes, so I will finish a bit earlier to give you time to ask questions, share your own experiences and examples, or maybe raise something with your colleagues, or if nothing else, just to have that longer morning tea, which we are all looking for. And also for people online, feel free to put it in the chat box, and hopefully Liz will tell me what those are. So the first point I wanted to discuss today is about informed decision making. So we can all agree that we need information. Whether we want information or not, we need it to make informed decision. And this is relevant for our students in their studies, for our work, for our family, for our communities, environments. However, what informed means is different from one person to another. And it also very much depends on the value we place on information. So whether you or your students are kind of people who will go and extensively search for information, look for different worldviews and world points, compare them, contrast them before you are ready to make a decision, or you are more likely to go just with the first few hits that Google returns, or, for example, asking Alexa or Siri to give you an answer and accepting that as informed enough to make a decision, that differs from one person to another. What is relevant for our students, especially in today's world, is to be aware of that. So we don't always need to change the way they look for information and the way they make decisions, but they need to be aware of the consequences different ways of decision-making has in relation to the information they sought and they applied in their own lives. That decision-making, as I said, depends on the value, and it can support various aspects of our daily life. So decision-making, for example, which train to catch, what clothes to wear, or something far more serious in relation, for example, to health aspects or nutrition or anything else. As I said, because we live in this complex world where information comes from many sources, it is also important to keep in mind that informed decision-making can vary from one situation to another and from one day to another. However, it is also connected to the roles and responsibilities we have in our lives. And for that reason, one of the exercises I always like to do with my students is to get them to journal and to think about their information needs and their interaction with information systems, and how that affected their ability to not just make a decision, but also conduct a particular role, whether that's a role of a family member or role as a student in your schools or in our universities or as a worker in whatever place they work in. But also responsibilities. So if you are seen as a person who has expertise in a particular area, what does that mean in terms of your responsibility to find the right information, to evaluate that information, and to inform other people? So to build information literacy skills of others. And that is also a useful exercise to do. So to ask students to go and teach an information literacy skill to somebody else in their community, and then observe possible differences and challenges that come along that. So that red thread of information weaves through decision-making, but also helps us to fulfill our roles and responsibilities. However, it also helps us to create or maintain or change our perception of our identities. For many people in Aotearoa, identities are complex and made of multiple belongings to different groups. And it is interesting to observe in our own personal lives how information supports or hinders that identity. So what is in our immediate personal space of information that speaks about our identity, that speaks about our belonging to a particular culture, information that might be written in multiple languages if we are living in multiple language household, or information that helps us on a daily basis to pass on knowledge and customs and traditions of groups we belong to. It is also important, so if you are facing situations where people have dementia or any other particular circumstances where those identities may be challenged or fractured, how you can use information space and interaction with systems and devices to help maintain that identity, to help bring information back when it's most needed. There's a lot of conversation around smart houses, Internet of Things, and other interconnected information-related activities that can support your daily lives. And some of us might be very enthusiastic about that idea. Some of us might not want anything that is based on surveillance or taking our personal information, even if it means offering personalized information services. But it is something to consider. So whatever part of technology we bring into our lives, how is that supporting our information environment? We also need information to unleash our creativity. And with AI, this is an interesting conversation nowadays. A couple of days ago, I had a meeting with a colleague overseas, and this colleague is in his 70s. And we had a strongly worded discussion about whether or not we should include AI-generated images in a book chapter we were writing. And I had some ethical and aesthetical concerns, just trying to look for the right word. And he called me old-fashioned. Oh, how old-fashioned you are. You don't want to use AI, and it can be so creative. It can do far better things than I ever could. And I think the point he was trying to make is, I'm older than you and I'm embracing this AI world. I'm embracing opportunities. And I was like, let's hold on for a moment and let's discuss possible challenges. So the question, especially when working with students, is also how to help them. They will probably, most of them, naturally embrace opportunities that come with development of technology, but also how to bring that awareness to their mind that there are always challenges, and even when you are using something, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, there are many, many opportunities, and we will come to them later as well, but how to use them responsibly. So responsible AI is a very big and interesting topic to teach at the moment. So just a little note on the creativity side. And then information that supports records and legacy. We all need record keeping in our lives, whether to provide our identities in various official environments. For example, when we are moving countries, that can be a particular challenge to prove and to maintain records of your identity. Health records, interactions with health systems. These are all examples where we need to think about what portion of all the vast amount of information we are creating and producing today is actually a record of what and what do we want to keep. Working with students, it is always an interesting discussion when you talk about relationships that form and then possibly break apart. So you are creating all those photographs, maybe exchanged social media posts, emails, text, and so on. And then after a relationship changes the nature or ends, what do you do with that record of a relationship? So that's a good example that brings complexities of information world to that personal level of connecting with people and living our lives. And also legacy in terms of what we leave behind. Do we just create and pile up information and then say, yep, I have a full email account of communication, I have many hard drive disks or cloud storage spaces full of information that I created. Is that a legacy? So how can we use information to tell stories of our lives and also to curate stories of our lives? We do some of that on social media, but the personal space of information is far more intertwined and complex. And that inevitably brings me to digital footprint and afterlife. I know students learn a lot about digital footprint in schools, but one of the aspects of it is something we don't talk enough about, and it is related to death and dying and how information persists long after we are gone. So what happens in today's world where digital immortality is not a science fiction scenario? So there are services that can train AI based on your information to digitally resurrect you, to serve as a replica or as a surrogate of what you were as a person while you lived. And this is a significant challenge for society because developments are going ahead of ethical and psychological research that can actually estimate consequences of interactions with such dead bots and replicas of real people. And this is a challenge for those who die and then their identities persist in digital space and weave with the life of living, but also for those who are exposed to such information, whether they want to or not. Usually when I start talking about this topic, that is, somehow the atmosphere gets colder in the room. So I won't talk about this a lot, but I'm just bringing this as one example of that red thread of information that continues even after a person is gone. And also, as a final point for this slide, is intentional versus accidental collections. So we, I think, unfortunately, still have that inherited mindset that just because something is digital, the space is unlimited and it does not have consequences if we just pile up things. But it does. So when we talk about information, we need to keep in mind sustainability. We need to keep in mind that maintaining all these storage spaces also has a consequence and uses energy and costs the earth, but also us as individual people. So thinking about how to promote that mindset of deleting is really necessary in an information age. And the reason why I talked about all these things through personal perspective is because this is something that will underpin the way students study at our university. And the lovely slide Amanda had about all the aspects of values and all the aspects that underpin those values at our university actually had these elements in it. So how can students use information to fulfill their role while studying, working, and having families? How they can make informed decision? How can they interact with university systems, which are sometimes challenging on their own, and actually make good use of them, make them work and support their learning rather than fighting with the systems and trying to squeeze their learning within a space that might not work for them. This is particularly true for neurodivergent students or any of those people whose minds work in a different way. So, for example, when you have a screen, and I had many examples of students not submitting assignments just because they could not see the submit button in system. So switching conversations from something is wrong with you if you don't see the submit button to how can we make this system better and work for diversity of people. But it is not just for individuals. This is also similar for personal and business contexts. So business contexts also need information to make good decisions, to support different roles and responsibilities within businesses. So access to the right information, but also restriction of access comes in relation to those roles and responsibilities. Businesses that use information to make clear what their identity is and to unleash creativity of their employees are likely to be more successful businesses in today's world. Records, so particularly organizations that must comply with Public Records Act, need to think about which records they need to maintain. Those organizations and businesses that are likely to fulfill official information requests, how can they maintain their records in a way that will help them find the right information at the right time, make sure they are not giving anything sensitive away, and use those records to demonstrate compliance, but also to maintain their businesses in disruptive times. And also legacy aspect is relevant there as well. So for example, businesses change, they are shut down, they are merged. So legacy aspect that relies on information comes through in that context as well. And also digital footprint of a business is something I think very interesting for students to study. So to look at web pages, social media presence of various companies and the trails they left online over, for example, the last decade, if they are a business that existed for so long. So thinking about that digital footprint, it is easy to find connections between personal and business context. And if students have awareness of their personal context, they're more likely to have awareness of the business context as well. So when they come as workers, they will be, to use Amanda's words, world ready, not just work ready. So there are connections that can then strengthen both personal and work side of things. I also wanted to use government as an example through that, but maybe at the moment it's a bit challenging story. However, governments also rely a lot on information to demonstrate their relevance in society, to show their roles and responsibilities, and also to shape the future of our information societies through their policies and through their programs. So interaction between business and government and individuals, particularly in the area of various information policies and how those affect our lives, is a really interesting example to think of. So anything related to privacy, surveillance, digital literacy, digital inclusion, intellectual property, basically every government policy is in some way information policy. So if you need examples to work through with students and to think about that omnipresent aspect and nature of information in today's world, it is interesting to read through some of those policies through that information lens. Increasing complexities in today's world are inevitable. And as I said, some of these will slightly diminish as we go on, some of these will increase. And if you look at information environment in the past 40 years, we've seen ups and downs in many aspects of information world. It is a changing technological landscape, and because of that, changing social and legal landscape as well. although a regulatory environment tends to go a bit slower and is very often reactive rather than proactive when it comes to tackling some of these technical and societal challenges, this is inevitably intertwined space. So when we think about how a new piece of technology or a new digital environment or a new system that we are using in our study and work, how that will impact our work, we also need to think about what will change, how will people's behavior change, what will our students and our colleagues do differently. So AI is a wonderful example of who embraced what and who didn't. How did we use AI, for example, to support and increase our productivity, but also what is the price we are paying? So how to maintain this balance? So it is always a balance between technological, social, and legal landscape. We pay a price. We are all experiencing information overload. So how many of you were in a situation where you went to check something on your phone, and by the moment you opened it, Google suggested a news article to read, or you saw a message from your friend or from a family member, and a couple of minutes later you completely forgot about what you wanted to do? I think that this is our daily experience, and it happens to everybody. So how can we increase our literacy skills to help us cope, to help us manage that feeling of being overloaded with information, when information becomes a burden, because that has consequences. So you might not spend as much time as you initially intended on finding the right information if you're bombarded with it all the time. So we need to develop strategies to deal with information overload, cognitive and affective side of it on a daily basis. For those people who use multiple languages in their daily life and environment, that information overload can come from even more sources and be even more complex. So this is also something to keep in mind, and maybe work on developing strategies to cope with information overload in those particular linguistic settings. And then also information overload that comes with transitions, and going to university is definitely one of life transitions that some students will experience. So life transitions are many, and when we talk about changing landscapes, our whole life is a series of transitions. Some are big, some are little. However, information and information readiness and literacy skills can ease those transitions, can help us prepare for those transitions, but can also develop that reflective mindset in our students to help them consider what was successful in this, for example, transition to university. How did I use those tools and systems and information around me? How did I use community and network of people to build a solid structure that supported my transition? We all like to tend and like to come to new environments and start from scratch, either thinking that our previous experiences are not that applicable, or thinking, I need to be doing something else. But we actually should build on previous experiences. So students that come to our university already have some great skills when it comes to information management, digital technology, studying and learning strategies, and just coping with social world around them. So we tend to build on those strategies, but it is also important to make students aware that they should use those previous experiences to help them transition and to be more successful. So we are always more successful if we build on something we previously learned. And that helps coping with information overload. Now, information disorder is another dark aspect of living in an information world. And by information disorder, I mean dealing with all sorts of false and inaccurate information, usually captured under terms misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, all referring to inaccurate information or false information, but differing in the extent of intentional harm that is caused by spreading false information. And this information disorder can come from taking information out of context. So even though information may be in its essence accurate, taking it out of context makes it inaccurate or false, which brings me back to the value of record keeping and making sure that we understand wider context as well as a particular piece of information in front of us. And this is becoming increasingly complex. When I taught information literacy skills 20 years ago, we had structured way of demonstrating this is relevant because, the author is relevant. You can easily distinguish true from false. You can tell that the source is reliable, but this is not the case anymore. You can have very, very convincing false information and take it as accurate and then spread it unconsciously further on. And sometimes you are just not sure. And this can cause significant challenges, not just in our workplaces and in our study, but also within our families if we are faced with different and contrasting opinions. So equipping students with information literacy skills is not just about distinguishing between right and wrong information, but also understanding the impact it can have on people's lives and that cognitive and affective feeling that follows it. So how can we actually preserve our well-being in a world that is informationally disordered in some way? As I said, these are all big topics. So if I continue, we might skip morning tea completely. So I won't go into more details. But if you have some thoughts that you would like to share or discuss, note them down and we'll come back to them later. Another increasing complexity is fragmentation of information spaces. And by that, I mean multiple devices, multiple online spaces, cloud storages, accounts, email accounts, social media accounts, bank accounts, health accounts, all sorts of, not to mention all the loyalty awards and things we have because we want to, are forced to have. So this is all making our information spaces fragmented. So when you find yourself in a situation that you need to find, that essay I wrote 2 years ago or something, some other information that is of relevance, it is becoming increasingly challenging to find that information. However, fragmentation has other consequences as well. And that is, we forget where we gave out our information, our personal addresses and date of births and credit card numbers and so all sorts of things. So this is making us vulnerable in our information spaces. While there are some promising directions that AI can bring those fragmented spaces together and bring you more control over those spaces, it is still, a trained algorithm that uses a lot of private and personal information and has access to that information. So this is another awareness to keep in mind as we balance pros and cons of living, studying, working in an AI world. Data ownership, data sovereignty, two different concepts, but I brought them together here, is another increasing complexity in today's world. When we talk about data ownership, we can go back to that personal example of, for example, you took a photo, but that photo contains other people. So who has the right? Who has access to that photo? Who has the right to share that photograph? I have an 11-year-old daughter, so every time I share information and photo of her, and I'm very much pressured by our overseas family to almost live stream that aspect of her life, I need to ask her because it's her on that image. And also for students, I think it pays to bring attention to the fact that, yes, you might be recording and taking photos of every single aspect of your life now, but imagine yourself 20 years or 10 years from now on looking at those images or sharing those images with your new partners, children, or whoever will be in your life. What aspect of it do you actually want to preserve and what will make you uncomfortable? So thinking about data ownership on that personal level, but then extending We also readily give away information to businesses. The other day I was buying, and we're trained to do that. The other day I was buying a t-shirt in a store on Lambton Quay, and the lady selling said, okay, can I have your phone number? And I actually started saying my phone number, because before I stopped myself thinking, why do you need my phone number? I'm just charge me, I will pay. And I don't need a receipt. You don't need to have my phone number. But we are so used to giving that information away. So who owns our data is another big discussion to have. And then data sovereignty as a concept that implies that data produced about a nation, within a nation, for a nation should stay under control of a nation, which makes international and global businesses challenging, which makes legal environment challenging, and which makes conversations our governments have quite challenging. So the question also is how much say we have, especially when it comes to indigenous information and indigenous data sovereignty. I think I mentioned privacy and surveillance to some extent, but we are also willingly living in a world where cameras are all around us, and it can be easy to forget. And in many aspects, this is for our own safety, but in many aspects, it is also not entirely necessary. So thinking how to train, how to teach our students, how to help them develop that mindset to be aware of that constant surveillance and what actually that means for the privacy and protection of our personal lives. Also, as we age, as we maybe embrace technologies in our home that might actually monitor us to help us live more healthier and safer lives, what does that mean if streaming of our lives is shared with a medical professional or a family member who is not living with us in the household? So these, again, delicate lines between privacy and surveillance is another topic to think about in an information world. And the final point is around knowledge and open access. And this is an interesting discussion in an information society because it brings together different worldviews. Is knowledge for everybody? Is open access something that is our right that is given? Or are there situations where some things should not be as easily accessible, where we should not grant open access? And it is an interesting conversation to talk to and to have with students as they go through their education, to see how their ideas of what knowledge is, how they can use resources to create and to learn, but also how they can share information they create, how those worldviews change. I have an interesting example about tattoos. I research information experiences of people with tattoos, and that question about intellectual property and knowledge and open access is very interesting because when you ask them, because many people look for inspiration for their tattoo images online and then maybe have more or less complex conversations with their tattoo artists about what can and cannot be copied. So interesting discussions about intellectual property. But when you ask them, to whom does your tattoo belong? And then there is silence. Does it belong to the artist? Does it belong to you as a wearer? If your tattoo has elements that connects you to your family, does it belong to them as well? So such life examples that are very relatable to people on an everyday basis are interesting examples as conversation starters for these big questions around knowledge and intellectual property and open access. And these complexities, of course, have impact on people, but also businesses and government. So this was just a run through some of the complexities and some of the characteristics of our information worlds. But I want to kind of bring some positive side to this final part. There are opportunities, and there are many opportunities for studying, living, and working in information and AI world. The future of work is changing. The other day, I listened to a presentation where they talked about research that aimed to use virtual reality to help workers who are either sharing spaces or are working while commuting or are just in an environment where they can't focus, to use VR sets to create virtual working spaces, even when they are physically present in different settings. So that is an interesting direction to observe how our future of work will change, not just in terms of working physically or remotely, but in terms of practices, in terms of interaction with people, in terms of productivity. Digital inclusion is another big area to keep in mind and to work on. As we saw over the past decades, there were many, many instances where people were left out, and this is still happening. But it is also important to give that opportunity to be excluded if you want to. So there are still a lot of business services, government services that are pushing that digital environment without taking into consideration the effect that that might have on some people who are not ready or do not want to be digital included. So that conversation about digital exclusion and inclusion that has been going on for decades is becoming redefined in an AI age. Another interesting opportunity is around migrating societies. So there are millions of people who are migrating today, some voluntarily, many forcibly displaced due to conflicts, due to natural disasters, climate change, and so on. So how can information and AI world support those migrating societies? What happens when people migrate from one context to another is that information landscape, and by information landscape, I mean the way they perceive information, the way they understand information, apps and services they use, that becomes fractured. And coming into a new environment, people need to rebuild those spaces. So how can we work on those fractured information spaces and landscapes together to support migration as a huge phenomenon in today's society? And then finally, life and death in information society. The way we live, the way we die, the way we leave our legacy has significantly changed and will keep on changing. So thinking about creating our legacy and creating our digital footprints as we go rather than a retroactive exercise is another important area to keep in mind. So I won't go into many more details because I would like to wrap up now and give you an opportunity to ask questions and discuss. I will just finish with emphasizing what we do in our Bachelor of Commerce. And I will just briefly talk about information systems, which is one of the majors within, but it is also a perspective and aspect that is embedded in all the other majors. So it is very interdisciplinary in nature, and it connects people, processes, and technology, which is what information world is all about. But the reason why I'm emphasizing information systems is very often students come to us thinking, that's building something that's too techy for me. I don't want to have anything to do with that. However, we are all encountering and using information systems on a daily basis. So thinking whatever the subject of the study is, either in secondary education system or tertiary, students are regularly interacting with business systems. Uber, ordering pizza, going to McDonald's and interacting with those screens there, ordering a receipt for health issue, communicating. So there's that embedded information system aspect in every single part of our lives. So getting more familiar with information systems as an area of study, but also as a perspective within the Bachelor of Commerce is, I think, important to bring attention to. And it supports interdisciplinarity because information is of relevance in business, in health, in education, in government, everywhere. I would just also like to emphasize that we focus a lot on work integrated learning. So many of our students study and work at the same time, but also university assessment tend to bring those experiences together. And I think this will be particularly important in an AI world. So studying, but also experiencing how our businesses and government are shaping. All right, I think I will stop here and just instead of me talking about concluding things around what it means to study information, what it means to study in an information world, and what it means to be prepared to study in an AI world, I would just like to open for questions or any comments you might have. If nothing else, what went through your mind?
Seen the bio of me here. I'm the Associate Dean Learning and Teaching here. It's a fairly new role for me, but I've been at the university for 30 years, following degrees in philosophy and public policy. I'm actually based in our School of Government, and for most of my academic career, I've taught professionals, in-work professionals in the public service. So I'm an unapologetic academic nerd. I've probably got much more content than we have time for, so I may zip through a few slides, but you will have them later for your reference. I've already modified the topic of my presentation, following Maja's comment that we can't possibly cover all the implications of learning and assessing, so I've just said some. Really fantastically following Maja's comments about our students and their experiences. This slide shows, I suppose, my teaching philosophy, where we have a transfer model where the individuals come in with all sorts of experiences, knowledge, skills, dispositions, aspirations, and so on. And then they go out following some duration in our university with knowledge, skills, etc., that they put to some sort of use. And I guess what I want to say is, first of all, we're focusing on the environment where Gen AI is part of that transfer model, but also that the pull of the future comes into the university. So I'm countering the idea that we have a linear progression through where students come along and get added to somehow and go out bigger, different, better than they were coming in. And I'll circle back around to that concept when we talk about motivation. I often look at what words mean, the semantics of them, which leads me to focus a little bit on what we think about when we look at the word generative. So generative AI, generative learning. A classic definition of artificial intelligence produced instantaneously by Copilot. What I do with my students is get them to put their queries into AIs and have a look at them to start to develop their critical attention to the kinds of questions dealing with information that Maja already introduced to us. So here, if I were taking time with my students, I might guide them to notice some of the terminology that's used, some of the anthropomorphizing tendencies. Do your students refer to and talk to their AIs as a person, as a he very often rather than an it? What does it mean to say mimicking human-like creativity? What does it mean to say models learn and use knowledge? Aren't those human characteristics? So it's just a kind of a sensitizing area at the moment for thinking about Gen AI. But that leads me to look at what education psychologists have said about what they call generative learning. So the idea that learners, not the machines, learners generate their understandings, and this allows them to use their knowledge to generalize, categorize, and solve problems. And this definition comes from the National Academy of Sciences, second edition on how we learn or how we learn to, or something like that. I do have all the references I've used that aren't AI references in the slide pack for you to have a look at later. So as I go through this presentation, I'm building up a series of observations about Gen AI in the university. And the first one is getting our students to use Gen AI in an environment where we can help them critique and think about what they're doing and think about this anthropomorphizing tendency to keep clear. The next thing to focus on in my model of transfer of learning is the motivational aspect. So again, from the same National Academy of Sciences report, drawing attention to what motivates human learning and therefore what educators can do to support that. And these concepts or these strategies or tasks are not knowledge focused. And this won't be news to you at all as educators. But the point I want to make with respect to motivation, and this has been a little bit of a epiphany moment for me, is to make sure our students know why we are doing what we are doing. And if we expect them to use their motivation to deepen their learning, that we're really clear that that's why we're doing and what we're doing, and that they're doing things like reflective journaling to help them see their motivations, because that pull of their future, where they're heading, enters into the effectiveness of the learning opportunities that we provide for them. So the idea that we're explicit in our philosophies with our students, especially at the tertiary sector. If we are able to energize their motivation and their curiosities, then I think it's an easier task to inject AI use into that structure, so that AI is no longer seen solely as a way to shortcut, to change, to cheat, to step away from the learning objectives that we have, but becomes naturally part of what they want to do because they're getting the feedback from what they're doing relative to their motivations and their challenges. So again, in our introductory courses for business subjects, we're using grand challenges to create that motivational pull. And we are encouraging and enabling and allowing them to use AIs. We're obviously all of us in a little bit of a learning zone ourselves, and how this works and how their use is actually increasing their learning, and how they are drawing on their own experiences and working together in a more realistic kind of environment. So we hope from day one to normalize the use of AI as and when it's appropriate. For one thing, it's hopeless to ban it. That's not realistic. We know that our students are using AIs and they will use them. We'd rather they're transparent and critical users rather than attempting to hide and dissemble and be dishonest about their uses. But that does lead to the really crucial question of whose work are we seeing and what do we think about that? This slide reminds me, because the image is borrowed from a wonderful series of resources at the University of Sydney. So again, I will refer you in the references to those resources, but there's an amazing collection of resources for us all as educators, videos, up-to-date blogs, really keeping on top of what's new. Every trimester, they're refreshing what the AIs are up to. They're refreshing what we do in AI and assessment. Wonderful blogger called Daniel Leo. I can't remember his first name for sure. Anyway, I had hoped to show a little bit of a video for him narrating some of what's going on there. But anyway, this is just the reminder to have a look at that resource because it's really rich. But what we're doing in the BCom course in this area is kind of not expecting every element of what our students do to be about content intake and content outputs. So in class, we're having them think about a particular grand challenge and engage with their group. This particular example involves creating a picture of how they see a grand challenge. But what we're really hoping to see is them starting to work together recognizing how they're drawing on their own experiences when they talk about grand challenges. Following that, we have them do individual work using AI to carry on and create a picture for themselves that they've trialed in this participatory environment, and give us some explanatory notes that make it personal to them. And we're asking them to declare their use of AI. So the in-class activity looks like this. We require them to get together in a group, make a rich picture, and upload a selfie to prove they've done it. That's all. We're just looking at participation and experiencing the activity. What we are balancing, and again, from Maja's presentation, the word that came through to me very often was balance. And you notice a lot of her terms on her slide were this and this, this and this, but we're constantly in an environment where we're trying to balance. And here I'm focusing on the balance between where students work with AI and where AI is doing work for students. And this leads us to focus on thinking about AI as an assistant. It's assisting students to present their ideas, or it's assisting them to augment their ideas, to take a kernel of something they're struggling with and thinking about and want to bump up a notch or two, and using AI to better enable them to show what they really want to show, versus AI doing the work for them, pressing the button and say, do this task for me. And in that context, as many of you probably will already have explored, the AIs can do those things really, really, really well, to a degree that's difficult for us to detect. Even critical reflections can be done on AI by giving AI your characteristics, where you live, what your hobbies are, what last book you read, and what the concept is the teacher wants you to reflect on. And it will spit out something in your persona that is supposedly your critical reflection. The third point there is where we're actually underutilizing AI, where individuals are just attempting kind of a surface level response to their learning. Their curiosity is not engaged. They don't feel motivated to use AI in an assistive and augmented kind of way. And we have to then ask, is that learning ending up less than we would like to see? Are they somehow falling behind the bulk of the class when they're doing that? And it's a different kind of example of the digital divide or digital inclusiveness and exclusiveness that I think we have to be increasingly alert to. Sadly, or realistically, or unfortunately, or excitingly, these are quite ambiguous differentiations. It depends on the student, it depends on the task, it depends on the discipline, it depends on all sorts of things. Back to my original model, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of variables we're dealing with, and you all know this as well. There is no one student, there is no one right way to do anything. The world is ambiguous, and this is no exception. This slide here is a compilation from 4 of the 7 universities that have publicly available AI guidelines. And its attempt to kind of show the kinds of things we might ask students to do with AI assistance or augmentation, or even this particular format uses creation, which is the doing for, but in some disciplines or in some aspects of tasks and assignments, that might be something we would accept. So again, it's horses for courses. It's how we think through exactly when and where and how we want AIs to be used in our classes and our assessment work. So we have to decide how we want to use AI in assessment, what tasks, what they need to have, what they need to be able to find. Here, it's probably the case that in all our disciplines, functionality is improved by having some stuff in our minds. Even though you can look up a multiplication times table online, for some tasks, you actually kind of need to just have that recall. And every discipline has some of that stuff we want students to just have embedded, but the rest of it, they can just get somehow. What is that in our disciplines? Increasingly, we're focusing on creating tasks that are authentic, and I'll come back to that, or tasks that allow us to track the process of the work and the thinking that's going on, both of these as opposed to just focusing on the output. Authentic assessment is another classic example of ambiguity here, but it's inherently valuable when we think about it. It is connecting what they're learning in the classroom to what they'll need to do in the world. It's motivational because of those real world challenges. It can include a larger spectrum of reality so that the real world activity is embedded in a society and a culture that's meaningful for the students. It can be used to counteract some threats to academic integrity because of its realism. And it can promote equity because it brings students' experiences into the task. But it also is partly a way to get around the content insecure type of answers that students might give. But the ambiguity comes into play as well, because what's an authentic scenario for me is not necessarily the same as for you. What elements of reality are meaningful, are real, are context, background, environment, self-perception dependent or variable. It's not only about how tasks represent knowledge for practice, but how they represent the reality more fully that a student is aware of, the complexities that Maja reminded us about, and how authenticity is actually often in tension with learning tasks that we might want to see demonstrated. So the more we attempt to be authentic, the more real, the less likely we are to kind of isolate the learning tasks we want to see. So we have to think about how we support learning in that context. I asked, this one's ChatGPT, how authentic assessment can be made Gen AI proof. It came out with a sort of a C- answer from my perspective. I've been trying to gather ideas for assessment that are AI resistant, and this is just a poor kind of list for that. But again, it just illustrates how we can see what's just the way of getting ideas and seeing what's what in many cases. What we can do, and it's hard, and this is something that I've heard from colleagues who say, in this new Gen AI enabled environment, or even in contexts where we say, I want you to do this without AI, but they do it anyway, the assessment becomes exhausting because you have to sift through and try to judge what is, what isn't, what are they actually knowing and understanding themselves. Contrast to a previous era when we gauged understanding by the output. We said, you can't do this thing unless you understand it. Now that's harder and harder to detect. So one way we can do that is to really work with our rubrics and really be explicit with students to say things like, you can write whatever you want for as long as you want, but you're only going to get credit for this particular element. Whether we are assessing how well they use AI or whether we're assessing how well they actually can know something or do something. So I think we can work much more explicitly with communicating what we expect to see. It won't happen overnight. It's going to take a few, I don't know, years to get these things, and we'll continue to be adjusting to them. But I think that's one thing that we can be alert to. University of Sydney has developed this lane 1 versus lane 2 ways of thinking about types of assessment. And this has actually gotten traction quite globally now. Lane 1 is where we need secure in-person assurance of learning. And lane 2 is where we're using assessment to help students learn in one way or another. And it's more high trust because we can't ensure that it's students' own work. The message here, or the lesson here, is the worst place to be is in the middle of the road. Crashes happen there. So we can be really clear about when we need lane 1 assessment. It may likely be that we'll use that type of assessment less and less, which seems counterintuitive because a lot of us think we need to go to more secure assessment, more pen and paper exams, less opportunity for students to use AIs to do their work, and gradually shifting the culture into a high trust model, which says we're going to secure test less often, but it's more important. So when in a student's path of study do we need to assure they've learned something? Certainly by graduation. I don't want to graduate a financial analyst who loses companies' money. I don't want to graduate an engineer whose bridge falls down. You know, we need those assurances, but we don't perhaps need them every step of the way. And our students need to gradually understand that it's up to them to undertake formative assessment activities. It's up to them to start to learn for themselves. Eventually, they'll need to demonstrate it, but not every step of the way. So again, have a look at University of Sydney, fabulous resource there. The final point I want to touch on is something I've done with my students, and it's not counterintuitive so much as there's a word I keep fishing for and I can't find. It's where you do something so that the opposite happens, where you tell your children chocolate tastes bad, but they actually say that must be because it tastes good. It's that kind of reverse psychology, I guess, kind of thing. So what I'm trying to do here is find a way for students to appreciate themselves as human thinkers. And the counterintuitiveness aspect of it is human thinking is incredibly flawed and biased. And if human thinking is incredibly flawed and biased, we don't want them to think AIs are perfect. So neither do we have AIs all bad, humans all good, but both and therefore in balance. So that's where we're heading. And so the way we can work through that is to start to point out that, first of all, you don't think entirely inside your brain. You think by writing things down, you think by looking things up, you store information in places you can access more or less accurately or easily. And the access you have is broader than you yourself. So that's one aspect of it. But the limits and compensating activities is what I really want to focus on. So my starting point is to talk about the problems that have been identified with Gen AIs and their human analogs. Degenerative thinking, where the data gets cycled through outputs and becomes narrower and narrower and more biased. Rarer data gets harder to find. Humans do this too if they limit their news sources and their social media networks. The information just becomes degenerative. And with that, the erosion of diversity. And I had one colleague, it was a piece in the conversation where a teacher said, if I see the student use the word tapestry, I know they've used a Gen AI. Because it turns out there are like 50 words that Gen AIs use all the time, which aren't part of students' normal vocabularies. That'll change, but it's that idea that the erosion of diversity. But the one I really focus on is this idea of hallucination. So this is IBM, which is a computer company, and this is how they define AI hallucination. And what I love about this definition is how it uses this anthropomorphic language. It's a chatbot that perceives patterns. It creates outputs, that are nonsensical or altogether inaccurate. And so I asked my students, well, what do we mean by AI perceives? And they pop it into a Gen AI, and the answer is, well, actually, AIs don't really perceive. They don't experience or interpret the world. They process data. So here we're having students sensitive to the anthropomorphizing language of these Gen AIs, but also starting to recognize what generation of information is, circling back around to Gen AI versus generative learning, and just sensitizing that distinction. Then we look at human hallucination. So a false perception through one of the senses is how that's defined. But scientists and researchers have pointed out that actually the brain doesn't process all the perceptions that we have. Even sitting in the room, your perception is quite restricted. If someone were to fire a gun in the room, we would all go like that. But in the absence of something out of the ordinary, we go along, and our brain expects things to happen in a flow, and it's only those disruptions that stand out, which means that perception is really subjective. It means what my brain is attending to and how I am forming my conclusions based on a very small selection of perceptual input, hence brain-generated hallucination, which, by the way, is what we could say about any opinion we have. Regardless of whether the facts are true on which I based my opinion, I haven't located that opinion directly from the facts necessarily. So one thing to have notes is your kind of security blanket and not look at what you want to actually say, but I think we're doing all right. Which just leads to the comment that I would hope students have reached already, looking at the IBM's definition of AI hallucination as perceiving patterns and judging them, and we judge them to be wrong, to point out that the generation of anything is not the same as the judgment of that thing. And while AIs can generate stuff, content, and humans can generate understandings, only humans can make sense of anything that's generated. So what I want to leave students with going through this exercise is a mature and balanced understanding of themselves as human, flawed, but nevertheless uniquely capable individuals, and the AIs as tools. And one of the things about the AI as a tool is to say that this, contrary to, I think, a lot of the whiz-bang stuff going around, it conceptually is no different than assists to learning we have always had. I'm of the generation that had very little tools when I started my schooling, but I had mom and dad. I had dad for math, I had mom for writing. Those are assistants. And it's just kind of taken that and put it on stilts somehow. And we need to just keep alert to those distinctions. So I want to leave you with what I hoped were the 9 points that I wanted to touch on in my sum implications of Gen AI for assessing and learning. Help students see the machine as a machine. It's an ongoing process, and the flashier they get, the more we have to keep reinforcing that message, and therefore articulate the differences between machine and human. Be explicit in supporting motivated learning. It will take a lot of the exhausting pressure off us eventually if we can actually be, as we get better at that. We can't outrun AI. If I'd shown you the snippets of those videos from the University of Sydney, It's just amazing what these things can do. We cannot outsmart them and outrun them. AI does not pose conceptual challenges for facilitating learning. We may be moving to an environment with fewer tests, but where we test matters. We must, I think, use more authentic assessment. I've got that in inverted commas because what's authentic is not a one-size-fits-all, and certainly not restricted to simple or simplistic scenarios. If we really want to have that pull of the future coming into the classroom effectively. And the process of content generation and sense making are distinct, and only humans do sense making. So thank you very much for your attention. We've got about 5 minutes.
In that I will call students out with suspected AI, because it is so important to not have them use it if they're claiming it to be their own work. So this is what I do. I have a set of 8 criteria that says along the lines of, I have noted that your work has suspicions. I'm suspicious about some of it generated by generative AI. And these are the characteristics of that. A, it is using language that would not be used by a stage 2 student. B, you have gone way beyond the brief of the assignment, and I suspect this wasn't your own work. C, and I go down for 8 criteria. Your work has one or more of these features. Could you come and see me? Because we don't accept your work presented by someone, that has been done not by you. When you get this assignment, we have to know that you did it. So then they have a chance to come and see me and explain. The biggest one that I would say is really important, if there is one reference, which is more at university level, but you would also have this, that is made up by hallucination, it is academic misconduct immediately, and that is an immediate fail. So what happens is generative AI will pull the name of a journal, theory in social education, something like that, pull a title in that looks appropriate, pull an author in that looks appropriate, and make up a smashed up reference that is completely and utterly false. At that stage, it's academic misconduct, and it cannot be accepted for anything. So that is an immediate fail. And my students know this, and I warn them at the start that this is what generative AI is, and that if they're not clever enough to know that, don't use it, because you're going to get caught. And my tutors are taught to search through a few of the references that look weird and quickly pull it out. So that is, I'm really strict on it. And I had 20 students out of 100 use generative AI last year when it first came out. And I pinged every single one of them. You can tell it's not their language. You can tell it's gone far from the brief. So I give them not an accusation, but like, your work has the features of. One student has come back and defended that it was her work. Every single other one took the resub I gave them. Everyone that had a misquoted reference was failed because it's not their work. So yeah, I am a bit firm on this. I'm sorry, but we really need you guys at high school level to hold out against AI. They don't have the intelligence to be able to critique it well enough, so don't use it. At university, not one student in any of my courses can use it. At supervision level of PhD, not one student can use it, because what I want is critical and creative thinkers who have the ability themselves to know what is fact from fiction. And I can't do that if they're dabbling in and out of it. So they're not even allowed to use it for brainstorming, because I need to know that their brains are working. So I'm a little bit on an extreme position here, but I'm going to keep holding it out, because we know that generative AI isn't our friend. It is a tool that we can use for a few efficiencies, but not a critical thinker. It isn't a human, which we need. Okay, keep going. So APA isn't particularly complex, because there's a site you can go to on most university sites that says how to generate an APA citation, and you just put in the reference and it will generate it for you. The trouble is, if they just put in a URL, it isn't really telling us how and where they found it. So you would even have author, date, title, retrieved from. And I've just marked 20 of my initial teacher education assignments. There's some of them are seated here. Lovely to see you guys. And they're expecting students to do that now. We need to lift our game on referencing, particularly at the senior end of school. And there's citation, you can easily put in a reference and it will tell you how to write it. Yeah, you can just look it up. The Waka University has one, for example. QA, just complete silence. I would agree completely and utterly that there hasn't been enough leadership in this. And I would say we need to be, we're in this moment, which is a bit like reminds me of the millennium where digital learning started and everyone was like, get on the wave. We've got to be on the wave or we'll be left behind. And that's the same narrative we're given all the time about AI. We are now having schools that have no cell phones because it turned out to be so silly. We have data that shows that if the schools adopted digital to an extreme, they did far worse than if they didn't. So we know that, and the same will happen with AI. We know those that adopted it, the students will stop thinking for themselves and they will become lazy. It is just completely and utterly obvious. So what we need to do is be very critical and very cautious and hold a line, because we know what good teaching and learning is, and we don't need to allow generative AI to take over. So I just think we need leadership in this space. Sorry, I do have a few reckons on this, and it is a little, I do go off a bit. But at the same time, I think that we need some leadership here that says, it isn't that great for us. We need students thinking. Otherwise, we'll have a generation that in 5 years that doesn't know how to think and won't even be able to tell what is AI and what is not. So, our university discourages us from using them because they're found to be a little bit problematic. Nonetheless, they are a tool that can be used, and I would encourage teachers to consider it if it's at least indicates something. I know our students use it. They tell me the person in my group used it for the group work. So, we know that Chat0 can generate some useful data. You would then have to go on to say, here's the evidence I have. It's one of a piece of many pieces of evidence. Just back on how to change the assessment. So what I've done in my courses, because I'm absolutely insistent that students do their own work, is I've shifted my assessment a lot more to creative and critical thinking that's more specific to the exact context we're working in. So for example, if we are studying environmental education policy, I'm using concepts such as sustainability or something, I will make the assignment far more specific around that, and particularly around, for example, a field trip, an event that happens, a guest speaker. So it's far more generated by knowledge within what we have exposed them to, so that someone outside of that, or a generative AI, cannot know what that was, and it's far more difficult for them to be able to regurgitate that. So we actually have had more specific assessment schedules, because if it says, I expect you to use, these 3 concepts, to refer to this reading, to do that kind of thing, it gets harder and harder for students to game that. And I've brought into every single course I teach an in-class handwritten test. In my case, it's open book, because they can bring in some notes, but they have to write on the day. And I haven't had one complaint from 350 students that they're still handwriting assessments at stage 2 and 3 where I'm teaching. And that is the most accurate assessment I have in the whole year, because it can only be done right then on the spot. And actually, it's really, really useful stuff. And I say, don't even worry about, trying to be clever. You will find the questions, for example, using the concepts in EDUCT 315, explain this cartoon. There's nothing that you have to have a brain. And I warn them that at the beginning of the course. There'll be a test at the end. If you haven't engaged with the course, you'll find it hard. So we've got to get a little bit more clever, and that's an in-class. Yeah, so the kind of 30% test at the end of the course that I would have is saying, using the ideas generated through this course, tell me about this. Write a letter to the minister. So it's stuff that they have to think for themselves that wasn't particularly covered in the course, but all of the ideas are there. So the students which have attended, have engaged, actually fly. And it's a really nice way to encourage them to engage all through. It's what NCEA doesn't allow us very well to do, because you have to engage. We're going to move on to a slightly different topic. So just to introduce a little bit of my background. So I'm involved in initial teacher education and social science, and particularly social studies education. So the other thing that I have been doing is writing the latest New Zealand curriculum, Te Mate Aho, and I have been involved in the consultation over NCEA. And I have done probably now about 8 years of work on NCEA transitions to university. So on the back of that, I'm going to give you a few more of Bronwyn's reckons, and why we have a problem with NCEA emerging that has become very, very clear over the past 20 years. So without further ado, we're going to continue because lunch is waiting. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of where are we at. We're in a really, really tricky moment, and I'll explain that for NCEA right now and curriculum policy in New Zealand. And then what do we know about the transition of NCEA graduates and university success? The evidence is becoming very, very clear around some things. And what steps could we use to support student success, having got a slightly problematic assessment system running in New Zealand? So I'll make a start on that. Don't worry, we will have time for questions. So where are we at? So if I showed you this slide, and I showed this slide to my initial teacher education students last week, we're in a really tricky moment. We have simultaneously 3 curriculums running, and I have no idea which curriculum to teach my students. You have no idea which curriculum you should be using. We have the 2007 one, which hasn't been disestablished, it's still there. We have the Te Mate Aho, all of the curriculum documents, which there was only 3 finished, maths, English, and social science/history. It has now been completely removed from every website you could ever look about the middle of the year. And then we have 2 emerging ones, none of them useful for us at secondary. So I train secondary students, English 0 to 6, a draft, mathematics 0 to 8. Put up your hands if you are still using the 2007 curriculum. About half. I'm finding about half of schools are still using it to some extent. Put up your hands if you're using some of Te Mate Aho or some of. Yeah. And then we have this emerging one, which is meant to have arrived for term 4 and hasn't arrived yet for English and maths, and it's the only one there. So we have had to teach our teachers in training 3 curriculum this year, and they're expected to know all of it because every school could be using 1, 2, or 3. Pragmatically, the 2007 is the most steady option in some ways. But we know there was this curriculum moment which happened the last couple of years, which is really different. So we're in a really, really tricky place. And I don't know any country in the world with this amount of chaos around curriculum and assessment right now. So as you know, we had these other drafts arrive. And when I taught Henry, even last year, we were teaching the draft histories curriculum, the integrated history social science curriculum, and we had drafts in maths and English that were rolling out into the schools but not prescribed yet. All of these have now been removed, every single one. So that one's an interesting moment. We have this assertion from the current government that by the end of the year we will have the full years 9 to 13 maths and English curriculum. Still hasn't arrived, and we're up for about 3 weeks of finishing school, to be implemented next year. And then we have science, technology, health, learning languages, the arts, and social sciences to be rewritten again in place next year to be taught in 2027. So that is really important. And then if we look at the lineup between the curriculum and NCEA, and I have to say, I was behind the scenes, one of the reasons why we are not implementing level 2 and 3 right now, because it just made less and less sense because there wasn't a curriculum. So if you look at these dates here, we have a number of years of curriculum development. In the meantime, NCEA just going holus bolus development of the whole of level 1 with no curriculum in place, that they were making up their own curriculum. Development of level 2 and 3, making up their own curriculum. Last year, all curriculum areas were developed with big ideas until some of the quality of that work became so apparent that it really wasn't curriculum writers who were making up that curriculum for the NCEA assessment. So me, amongst others, wrote to the minister and said, just stop. Everything is getting sillier and sillier, and you're going to have to redo it. So we're in this moment now with level 1 now in place, but level 2 and 3 paused. And here we have still no curriculum to develop. So, I mean, no country in the world would wish this upon their teachers. This is just absolutely ridiculous that you're expected to be able to be operating in this place here. So on the back of that, we have a strong, strong critique emerging of NCEA and how it is failing us in many ways. So some of these are some of the headlines in the news, and a book put out, New Zealand Initiative, who now hold a very high status position within the current government in their opinions, critiquing NCEA and how it was failing many of our students for their futures. This critique even came in from the PPTA. So in 2017, very unusually, because the PPTA is very pro-NCEA, always has been, they put out this report that said basically NCEA falls short in manageability. No secondary teacher would disagree. The pendulum has gone too far towards assessment at the expense of curriculum. And then it was the worst decision in the world to try and put on better public service targets on meeting 85% pass rates, because this exacerbated the trends towards schools focusing on credits rather than high quality learning. So the PPTA very unusually came out and said that. That was 2017. By 2018, the then Labour government announced the NCEA review on the back of some of the work we'd done at university here and other factors that basically said the system is failing us. They said they would identify a whole lot of different aspects for change, including enriching and strengthening literacy and numeracy and reimagining NCEA for powerful learning, removing barriers like fees. So they started this big NCEA review, massive consultation, and then announced a change package which had these 7 criteria about making NCEA more accessible, strengthening literacy and numeracy, enhancing Mātauranga Māori, having fewer and larger standards, simplifying the structure and showing clearer pathways, and keeping NCEA level 1 as an optional level. They had announced initially that it could be removed, now optional. So nonetheless, that momentum started a change that got out of step with curriculum development and led to this. This is a level 1 English current 4 suite of achievement standards, 2 internal and 2 external. So what the consultancy group suggested is that to reduce the fragmentation that NCEA was creating in schools, we reduce it to smaller, larger standards. However, what is now happening, of what you know of these standards? What is now happening? Schools are dropping entirely level 1 or dropping the externals. And so kids end up with 10 credits because you only need 60 to get through to level 2. So there was no incentive to do this full suite of larger ones. So now students are being taught even less than what was intended. So this was one of the reasons I just said we just have to stop. This isn't solving the problem of the gaming which is going on. So let me explain what I mean by gaming. And just to bring us up to date, this was the 5th of April announcement from the Beehive that the government will be rephasing NCEA with an entire review of level 1 undertaken by ERO, additional review of other aspects, including methods for externals. The senior curriculum will be developed and an implementation plan developed from ERO's evaluation, and then NCEA level 2 and 3 fully implemented by 2028, level 3 by 2029. So everything is being dropped back. And on the back of that, the whole of the NCEA Ministry of Education team made redundant. Most of the New Zealand curriculum team made redundant. And by then, about 35% of all schools had dropped NCEA level 1. So you wouldn't wish this upon any Minister of Education, this huge mess that we're in. On the back of that, we have falling rates of UE attainment. And basically until about 2020, there was an increase in UE to some extent. The bottom line there is the UE line, purple. And NCEA level 1 is in blue, NCEA level 2 in red, and NCEA level 3 is year 13 level 1. So there's a big gap between getting NCEA and UE. There's always been that gap and it hasn't decreased over the years, and now it's starting to grow. So we have falling rates of students even able to get UE. Anyone have a guess why that might be? Why are fewer students? Okay, good. Yeah. We have a cohort going through that are significantly behind, up to 2 years behind in their learning. And no country in the world except Japan has nailed this. And what they did is stop every student from proceeding until they did 6 months of extra after school work. So they stopped. They would be very popular. And they paid the teachers to teach from 3 to 5 o'clock every day for 6 months, and that cohort caught up. But no other country in the world has done it. So that cohort coming through right from preschool through to university is behind on every single front. So you're right. The other thing is literacy falling and falling and falling, and I think we're starting to see it correct. So that's the bit I'm going to call gaming. I'll repeat the question. So students doing courses that aren't actually literacy and numeracy rich or able to get them into university has increased. So I'm going to look at that now and why that's happened from our research. So just one last quick catch up. So this is the percentage of students leaving school with at least NCEA level 1. Sadly, there's more and more leaving without any qualification, and the fact that schools have dropped NCEA level 1 will only increase. So you can see that 15% 2022, there's been a decrease and an increase over time. So what Jan Marshall, the head of NZQA, said is we know that about 25% in late 2023 were not planning on offering a full assessment program for NCEA level 1, and this means that for about 10% of school leavers, they will not have any qualification as they leave school, and that will increase as if schools drop NCEA level 1. So that's an aside there. So we were going to have a bit of a catch up on what you've been noticing, but what I'd like to do is just push through a little bit on the research and then pause and have a little bit of a look at what you've been noticing from your end. So a little bit on some of the research we've been doing about the transition of NCEA graduates and university success that has been conducted over the past 8 years. So one of the things I talk to my university lecturers about is that there are huge differences in the setup of NCEA from university. I don't need to go through these, but basically the ability to pick and choose assessments is a really different concept than university. We do not allow. I have students every year that say, I don't like that assignment. Can I do my own? And it's like, I'm sorry, sweetie, this doesn't work like this at university. You do all of them or there's no alternative. But that is encouraged within NCEA, picking and choosing, avoiding externals, all of that encouraged. And we have a lot of holistic assessment, like I was talking about, that celebrates being there for the whole course. NCEA doesn't. It has this fragmented approach to picking off bits of learning that you can then achieve in small bits. We don't have resits. We get asked for them every year from students. NCEA now only has resits for fails, but there was a case that went around the country of a student doing 16 resits, you know, between a merit and excellence, and the poor teacher having to mark and mark and mark and mark. So some of the big differences there. So when we did a survey in 2017, this was a group of us from the Faculty of Education that had become increasingly concerned with what we were seeing coming through from school. And we asked students about how well NCEA had prepared them for university. And in many ways, students love NCEA. Parents love it. Teachers love it. It's allowing a flexibility of choice, of assessment, a mix of internal, external, that allows you to navigate your way through with a huge amount of flexibility. Some people believe that develops self-agency, self-responsibility, managing time loads, stress levels. The research suggests it doesn't always. It allows you to avoid difficult things, but nonetheless, it does allow some of that personal autonomy to develop. So the problematic thing that students themselves admitted, so this is from their comments from the survey, is that they felt they lost the breadth of knowledge. They felt the assessment load was so heavy, there was little room for thinking, that the internals gave them a false sense of achievement, but when you did the external, you didn't always achieve to the same level, so the research confirms that. The other things the students said about assessment was there was no redos. Once it's done, it's done. University is not as flexible. School was easier by far. At university, there's no second chances. If you mess up, there's no option of a better grade. And then at university, the assessments are so close together and worth more than any assessment was at high school. School made it impossible to fail as they gave you multiple times to resit. Doesn't happen at uni. And uni marking was hard to comprehend at first. So this was a survey graph that said I had difficulty coping with the reading and or writing for my university work. Probably we've got there about 35 to 15, almost 50% of students agreeing or somewhat agreeing that the university reading and writing was difficult for them. This one here, I could just highlight a couple of the bits here about how university required much more time management skills and that needed improvement. You can see that big agreement in the middle with the circle around it. A hard time making new friends and feeling like I belong and struggling to keep up with the amount of work were also features that we heard from students arriving to university. So what we noticed on the other side, and this is why we put in place this research, around about 2014, we noticed a significant decline in student ability. And we were confused what was going on because the students hadn't got dumber. Why were they performing less well? So the science and maths faculties were particularly critical of what was coming through the door, to the extent that our software engineering program put in place a test for every student. They said, we no longer trust NCEA. We need a test to measure where students are at. And of that test, about a third failed dramatically, a third somewhat nearly passed, and a third flew through. So they picked up that third that nearly passed and heavily resourced them. But this was quite alarming to them. So we're trying to work out what was going on back there. So what we had noticed when I put in place some initial research around what my students who failed had done in NCEA, and found that they had avoided anything difficult, particularly high literacy and high numeracy standards, particularly physics, algebra, any English that required the essay, and chosen every other thing they could to avoid writing. So writing emerges as a really big issue for our students at transition. And what Aaron Wilson did was look at a range of school deciles and found that even the opportunity to learn was reduced for students in low decile communities. So they weren't even exposed to certain stuff. And this was done through streaming, but also a teacher saying, actually, I'm just going to teach you to the achieve level, not the excellence level, or what all these things reduced opportunities to learn, particularly marked by Māori Pacific and low socioeconomic students. So we now know that particularly Canterbury University Engineering has to reteach almost the entire Year 13 syllabus in maths, physics, calculus, because the schools haven't taught it. So I'll show you some evidence of that. What we found is that the social sciences weren't struggling as badly on that transition. In fact, if you'd done geography, English or history, by and large, you were reasonably well set up for university. So there's a thing going on between humanities, social science, and the STEM subjects. And NCEA was particularly hollowing out the STEM subjects. So there's a reason for that. And it's mostly to do with incremental learning that maths and science require. If you don't know how to do multiplication, you can't do algebra. You cannot go further. And it's very incremental. So at the same time as all of our literacy and numeracy rates were declining on our international measures, NCEA was rising. So these are the years between, you can see there, particularly that rise happened around about 2008 through to 2015. Anyone know why that was the case? Henry might be able to tell us. He was in my course when we studied this. Okay, what's going on? Why is NCEA rising and rising and rising and rising and every other industry going down? Absolutely. So what happened at this time was that the government brought in better public service standards in about 2010 and said to the schools, we now need you to get 85% pass rates at level 2. So the schools very quickly, and they said, we'll publicly report this in the newspaper, every school will be reported. So the schools rapidly rose to the occasion. We know that education can be manipulated. So they encouraged students into lighter and lighter weight courses and got these incremental rises that looked like very, very high rates of achievement. But UE, that line across the bottom there, did not change. So the students weren't getting brighter, they were just getting cleverer at navigating their way around NCEA, which allows that flexibility, which is really the biggest problem we have with NCEA. And that's why we call it gaming, because everyone's doing it, because they are avoiding the complex language, avoiding complex maths. So this is what we find now. This is 2023 data from NCEA. All you have to look is broadly that we have external assessed achievement standards. Only 13% got excellence at that. Internal assessed, wow, 25% could get excellence on that. But the number of external achievement standards set across the country is now down to about only 1/3 of the, or even less, 3 million versus 8 million achievement standards or number of credits. So schools have gone more and more into internal assessment and less to the external, where there's more rigor of knowing that one. And I'm not blaming schools on this. This is clever navigation of students. The whole system incentivizes this type of behavior, but it's got worse and worse and worse. So in NCEA algebra, this is a level 1. Some alarming work by a student of mine, Sarah Howell, for her master's, looked back at who was doing algebra. So this is called the MCAT. You guys know the MCAT. It's now removed, but basically every school in the country was expected to do it in September. It's 1 day, 1 hour. Every year 11 student does it. And what happened is that now we have, if you look at that decile 10 blue, less than 50% of schools even put their kids through that test, and that's decile 10. So the decile weight down the bottom, 2 and 3 and 1, 1, 2, 3 schools always had low rates, but they've even decreased, but now they're almost the same as decile 10. So that is a case of teachers, students, parents, everyone removing the opportunity to even do this algebra. What are the implications? If you don't do year 11 algebra, what happens if you want to study physics, calculus later on in school? You can't. It's such an incremental subject that if you don't do it, then there's absolutely no chance that you'll be able to pick up maths later. And so we have this devastating fall in numeracy across New Zealand, encouraged by NCEA as students have done that. So alongside that, the evidence came out, particularly around about March 2022, of a deep and worrying level of literacy decline. So particularly this finding that only 65% of 15-year-olds had basic proficiency. So that's the ability to read something like a contract if you are renting a house. So only 65% of students had that emerging through school, which is confirmed by our own internal data, national monitoring, and so on. When we look at our curriculum, and this is some research I've done with history teachers and so on, what we found is that our eclectic and open choice of curriculum has encouraged some of this decline. So schools that were choosing the history of surfing, or as in a girls' school doing the history of perfume, highly appealing to student interest, but very low in quality of knowledge and requirements of critical thinking. So this is all compounding an NCEA, which allows a lot of that navigation around these ones. And this incredible focus on allowing students to choose and follow their own interests doesn't allow them to learn about worlds beyond their own world and have a pedagogy of disruption, which is what Biesta would call the ability to learn something that you didn't know before you arrived at school that day. And our curriculum experience has allowed a lot of that as well. So digital technology, I missed this earlier. What our own internal research found is that most students in New Zealand now have access to devices at school, but most types of devices were negatively associated with PISA scores, even after controlling for socioeconomic. And this was particularly the case for tablets and interactive whiteboards, almost no merit whatsoever in those things. So the report concluded digital devices have the potential to enhance learning, but there are very few situations where this currently happens, and many in which learning may be hindered. So COVID lingering effects, I won't go on with this one, but basically our discussion before highlighted that we have this emerging issue, and particularly in poorer communities where students are 2 levels behind curriculum levels, and the attainment has fallen. The other slightly worrying thing is the rise of psychological distress by age. If you look at this graph here, the older age group, 75 plus, if you look at that on the far right, turquoise, by and large, if you look through the COVID years, marginally different, but not much. What happened through the COVID years for 15 to 24-year-olds? And this is the incredible toll COVID took on our young, that we are now bearing the brunt of as well. So for us at university, the mental health issue is so prevalent in requests for extensions, for students that can't sit in the room anymore, for students that can't present orally. A lot of this is coming through to us at university as well. So where are we for time? We've got a few minutes. So let's have a little bit of time for questions, and then I've got a 1 slide to finish on, basically. Oh, we can do 5 minutes. Yeah, you can eat quicker. So let's just have a quick look. Some new things. The literacy and numeracy co-requisites, which have come in this year. There's a reason for these low pass rates. 55,000 students sat these tests in May this year. 46% passed in numeracy, 59 in reading, and 46 in writing. And this is going to be a very long fix in New Zealand. It basically has been 15 years of decline in literacy. It'll take 15 to fix, maybe 10 if we're lucky. But can I just quickly explain what happened in literacy? We used to have a national literacy program till about 2012. And that program had books, resources, trained every teacher in literacy. Every teacher is a teacher of literacy, including you guys. And in 2012, Heke Parata, then National Minister of Education, took out all of that funding and put it into Kahui Ako. Kahui Ako is allowed to choose whatever they want. So the focus on literacy dropped immediately, because you could choose student agency, you could choose some other project. And so literacy did not become a feature since then. So that's like, we're coming up 12 years since then, 13 years of not being a feature required in schools, and the resourcing stopped. So from that moment, we have had a big problem in literacy. So this is an example of the literacy co-rec, right between 150 to 250 words. Your local councils developed an outdoor space, suggests why one of these options would benefit. So the students have to be able to write by themselves, and that's why we need to not give them an opt-out of writing all the way through schooling, which is happening a lot. Oh, you can do the visual static image, you can do the poster, you can do the oral, you can do this. No, actually, literacy means writing as part of many other features. They have to be able to write 150 words. So that's set, benchmarked against international, it was actually about year 9, but now year 10, and now it's going up to year 11. And this will take many years to fix. So this is my tips for how to help students succeed if they transition through to university. And this reflects back to the pipeline that we have here. So expose students to complex language, including more abstract vocab. We have to focus on vocab. We have to do the additional teaching around literacy. We have to notice punctuation. Focusing on concepts, language, be intentional about teaching this, because it won't happen by osmosis and it won't happen through ChatGPT. So do the externals. All of our research confirms these have a huge impact on future success, especially for STEM and economics students. So if they did even one external, they perform better at university. Because what the externals do is they put together a body of information and then ask the student to deliver that. And that's really good for their cognitive enhancement. Do maths. We did a study at university last year at Vic. There was 3 subjects which were predictors of success at university. One of them is maths. That was the most confirming. Any student that did maths even did better in humanities and social science. Why? Why is maths such an important thing for us? Statistics, yeah, it's a way of thinking. Problem solving, excellent. It's problem solving. It also requires a fair amount of diligence. You don't get it the first time often. So there's a cognitive load that goes with it that you wouldn't have in some other subjects. What are the other 2 predictors of success? Can you guess them? 2 other subjects at high school that were, if the students did them, they did immediately better at university by far. History is one we found in the past, and history, because of that high language load, is a predictor of success. And English with expository essays, not English with static images. Languages, well done. So if you do a language, all those students perform better. So if you're parents, make your kids do language. Because why language? You can't make it up. You have to learn something. So that cognitive load increases. There's one more subject.
Is that correlation causation? Are they doing that to become bright with language, or are they doing that because they are bright?
Probably both. There's also a high socioeconomic thing going on there. Exactly. And these are, I'm just telling you these, but they are caught up in it. There's one more subject that if you do better in. Not economics. It's another kind of elite. Music. Yeah. So basically music, maths and languages, including Te Reo Māori, including Pacific languages, all of these enhance our students' performance. And they are certainly, the middle class are doing them, right? So there's a factor there. But nonetheless, they show that. So, and my last point, don't allow AI, encourage laziness, lack of critical thought. We've had discussion on this one. So let's have, this is my last slide. This was me a weekend ago, walking across this hairy bridge in high winds. Basically, should be resilient. Learners only develop when something more difficult is encountered and overcome. That's how we build resilience. We don't build it from exposing them to only what they knew, only their interests. You have to do something, lean into something difficult to develop resilient learning. And NCEA allows us a cop-out, which is why I'm so critical of that system, and it really has to go. And I'd give it 5 years and it'll be gone. Okay, we've kind of run out of time for questions. I'm not going anywhere. Does anyone have one burning question, and then we'll break for lunch? So even the change we put in place of the 4 larger standards, I think is failing us, because the gaming culture is so prevalent now. And so I think we either have to fix that or have a different fix. So what I think is required is compulsion. Every student has to do English, maths, science, I don't know, at level 1, and that's required, because what that would do is everyone would then teach it and every student would be expected to learn it. That's a really different culture. That's a quick answer. Very problematic. Yep. All righty. Yep, quickly. Are you hopeful? Am I hopeful? Oh, what is that? Hopeful thoughts are you guys. My hopeful thoughts is that you are the teachers that know best how to teach. You know what students need. You're the experts in the classroom. Rise to the occasion, because this will be a rocky ride the next 3 to 5 years. And you guys just need to keep teaching, because you are the experts and the students relate to you and all of that expertise you have. Forget the curriculum, forget NCEA, teach well, because we're in for a really rough couple of years fixing this out.
Back in at the moment, so we're just a couple of minutes off 1:15, and we don't have the floods coming in. I'm not going to take valuable time from our next presentation with a long-winded introduction. I've invited Brad to say what he will about himself, and it's just my perfect pleasure to welcome you, Brad. I know we're all looking forward to what you have to say. Greener shoots in 2025, what an interesting topic for us. Brad will have to leave really sharply at 2 o'clock.
2:10-ish.
Okay, all right, we've got a little bit of time, so we'll just manage that. And then our final event of the day is a panel with a current student, a recent alum, and our academic speakers from this morning. So hopefully we just go from really interesting to really interesting to really interesting. With that, Brad.
Thank you. Good and good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic to be here. Very weird to be on this side of the lectern stage rather than in your lovely seats. My name is Brad Olsen. I'm the Chief Executive and Principal Economist at Infometrics. We're a private sector consultancy, started 40 years ago, far before I was born, in the midst of some big changes in the New Zealand economy. And it's pretty fantastic to still be going and still looking at quite a lot of the important topics that we see in everyday society. I attended university here at Vic back 2015 through 2018-ish, I think. And I say ish because a lot of my lecturers would possibly ask if that's true, given that I wasn't the best attending student. There are two reasons for that. One, because yes, I was lazy, and that's how university unfortunately seems to work. But more importantly, I was on university council, not university council, academic board and the faculty board here. So as a true nerd, I came to university, ditched my lectures and went to the boardroom instead. I'm also fortunate in the work that I do to appear quite a lot in the media. And I say fortunate, I don't know if that's true. No one's tried throwing tomatoes yet, so I'll sort of take it as a good enough start. But it does mean that we sort of get to talk about quite a variety of things out there in the economy. Yesterday, I spent quite a few hours on the phone at various media talking about regional economies, the likes of the closure of the mill in Tokoroa, some pretty challenging economic trends. Tomorrow morning at 7:25, I'm on the hits talking about the best shapes flavour. So, you really can't pick it in this role. What I thought I'd do for you for sort of the next half an hour, 35-ish minutes, is take you through a presentation that's sort of got three elements to it. And the brief for a group like this is a bit tricky. One, I want to give you a general economic update because I'm good in it and because I think you'll be interested because the economy has a pretty big impact on everything. Two, I want to give you a bit of a view of where we think particularly parts of the jobs market is heading over the next 5 years or so will have, I think, implications for the people that you're teaching and again, sort of the wider environment that you're operating in. And because, although I don't have first-hand knowledge, I do hear second-hand that resource and content creation is always valuable. I thought I'd provide a few bits and bobs that I certainly would have found fairly engaging as a student that hopefully you might be able to rip off and use as well. We'll do questions at the end if that's all right, just because there is a method to the madness of the presentation. Those online, I don't know how you ask questions, probably put up a hand and something, but again, we'll do that towards the end. First things first is the greener shoots that we're seeing in the economy. It's been pretty tough. It's obviously a difficult environment out there. The unemployment rate's rising, spending activity's down, the government's not spending as much either. But interest rates have also been falling recently. When they start to come down, when people actually refix onto those lower mortgage rates, they'll have a bit more money available. And so that is why we're sort of thinking that there are greener shoots more next year rather than right here, right now. How do we get to the need for greener shoots? And quite clearly not so green shoots at the moment. That one doesn't work. This one might. That one might. There we go. Look at that. I'm great with the technology. Inflation is back in the box. Now, I remember, as I was saying to someone before, inflation wasn't really an issue when I went through both high school or university. You could have almost just drawn a line at just below almost 2% and gone, look, it's pretty well fine at that point. At Infometrics, we have a bunch of spreadsheets for all of our data that we bring in, and we hadn't updated our food price index spreadsheet between February 2017 and I think January, February 2022. Until that point, it just wasn't that important. And then it was because the usual issues around both supply and demand came into play. And I think that's important because we sort of can see that still coming through in the numbers. Now, I don't know what sort of presentation style I have, but to be honest, I'm pretty sure that you can all read. So there's very few words here. There's just lots of pretty pictures because I think that's a good way to describe stuff. Long story short, the red box is where we're trying to get to with the inflation battle, somewhere between 2%. Between 1 and 3, ideally 2% all the time. Had been outside of that quite considerably for a while, and it was a good generation, a good 30 years ago, apparently, so I'm told by the history books, that this last happened. You can see here that not all parts of inflation have trended down in the same way. The headline inflation rate, the orange line back at sort of just over 2%, but pretty well in the right ballpark. Tradables, though, our overseas-based inflation sort of driving a lot of that decline in the inflationary pressure that we've seen. Basically, that's oil prices coming back quite a bit. And so, again, encouraging to see that there's less pressure on petrol and what have you. Also, nothing really to do with us in New Zealand. We didn't contribute to lower oil prices. We just get them imported in. So encouraging, but not really driven by us. The goods market, you can see there in the light blue line, a little bit more to sort of your fundamental economics of supply and demand, if you will. Funnily enough, when you hit households with a massive shock to their income and they can't spend as much, they don't spend as much, particularly on bigger and larger goods. And someone said to me the other day they wouldn't get out of bed for anything less than a 70% sale at Briscoe's. And I think that sort of highlights that, again, On the goods front, you just can't convince people to part with their cash quite as much. The essentials are happening, sure, but after that, not quite so much. The likes at the other end of the spectrum, the areas we're still concerned about, the likes of non-tradable, domestically based inflation, still too high, curving down slowly but surely. But again, a lot of the time, those pressures being driven by items that are not going to be as influenced by interest rates. We're seeing at the moment, in particular, the likes of local government rates, the likes of people's rents, and the likes of insurance all going up. Now, for a lot of households, even if interest rates tripled again tomorrow, those would be three things that they desperately need to try and put in the essentials part of their spending. So not quite as influenced. And then very lastly is services inflation. When we're paying for people's time, wage rates have gone up over time, and I don't need to tell many of you about the concept of sticky wages. And it takes a bit of time then for even a slowdown in that pressure to come through. We'll get to that more in a moment, but just a bit of a scene setter there. We're thankful as well that we're seeing interest rates now come down because inflation's in a better spot. Now, the Reserve Bank will swear until they're black and blue in the face there was no U-turn and no change in what they were doing. I would humbly submit that maybe there was a change between the light blue line and the green line, but that's just a personal opinion. You can see, though, look, a pretty big shift there, but even then, market pricing expecting quite a bit more in terms of interest rate cuts already coming forward. So again, long story short, inflation was too high. We needed to try and diminish demand because supply can't immediately respond. Demand has now sufficiently diminished. Now we can ease back. You will note, and I think this is, again, sort of an important theoretical economic point, that where interest rates might eventually land are not as low as where they were before the pandemic. And so it is that feeling that we're not trying to get to low interest rates. We're not trying to stimulate the economy. We're just trying not to strangle it quite so much. And so it is that sort of, everyone will talk about equilibrium points. I tell people it's the Goldilocks zone because it really is sort of where's the not too hot, not too cold when it comes to consumption. Now, the other interesting thing, and this is what I did enjoy learning as I sort of got into the economics game out in the real world away from just the textbooks, is that although your model tells you something, how it appears in real life is not always the same. Just because the official cash rate comes down 50 basis points doesn't mean that your mortgage rate does. To demonstrate that, here are some of the special mortgage rates you can get out there in the market. You've got over 20+% deposit out there, the 6-month and the 1-year rate. Now, the big one here is this data is up until the end of October. At the end of October, the official cash rate had fallen 75 basis points. The 1-year fixed mortgage rate had fallen 134. And what that sort of means, and what we're telling our clients at the moment around the country, is just because there are further cuts to the OCR to come doesn't mean there will be a one-to-one fall in your mortgage rate. Now, this is not personal financial advice, but anyone who does want to ask about their mortgage, and I swear it'd be like half of you based on every other conversation I've ever had as an economist. Honestly, people come up in the streets, the one thing they ask is that, again, maybe it's not that there will be sort of as large continued interest rate falls next year. But the important thing is that people will be refixing onto those lower rates. As they do so, they'll have more money available to spend on not their mortgage, and that means more consumption out there in other parts of the economy. Now, because we were talking about housing, and I swear that in terms of media, we would do sort of one housing story for every other one story about anything else in the economy. So I always do go through it because we have a fascination with it in New Zealand. But again, from sort of a pure supply and demand point of view, it does actually have some interesting implications at the moment. Unfortunately, I have learnt that despite getting told ceteris paribus back in high school, that apparently doesn't apply in the real world. And honestly, if it did, Jesus, job would be a lot easier. But we have seen a real turnaround in how housing activity has gone. You can see house prices here upping themselves 40% or so over the pandemic period through to sort of late 2021 and then falling back a bit. And you can see that our forecasts into the future, we're the lowest in the market, but we think house prices are relatively-ish flat into the future. Now, taking a step back, normally if you said interest rates are going to go down, therefore households are better able to service a mortgage, they have more money and all of that, there should be more demand. There should be more buyers in the market, right? And so that should sort of perk up activity. We think there's a few things going on, though. One, future population growth isn't going to be as strong. We've got net migration that's now sort of curving out the other side. We've also got the Reserve Bank's debt to income limits. So even though you might want to get a mortgage, if the bank has already used up its allocation of DTIs, you might not be able to get one. And of course, we've had a lot of building over the last couple of years. And so for the first time in possibly my entire economics career, supply is having an impact on the housing market. I say that because certainly even right here, right now, we're seeing supply come through. This chart looks at the number of houses available for sale on the market across the country. And you can see that number has now increased to sort of the highest point it's been since about 2015 or so. Again, very simple supply and demand says that if there are more sellers out there who are looking to sell and no real change in buyers as of yet, then there's a bit more competitive pressure to sell. In much more simple terms, if you go back to sort of 2021 when interest rates were fairly low, rock bottom sort of levels, you could walk into the bank and about 3 minutes later, you'd walk out with as many money bags as you could possibly imagine. And you go along to the open home and you and 50 other people would be there and you'd throw your money bags on the ground and try and buy the house. And of course, the seller, because he's got lots of demand and only one house, will take whoever's going to offer the most amount of money. And if you weren't that person, you load up your money bags into your wheelbarrow and then walk next door with the other 49 people who missed out and you rinse and repeat until hopefully you got a house. You go back through then to sort of late 21, more into 2022 or so as the housing market was turning, interest rates were rising. You went into the bank and about 3 months later, they let you out after looking through every Uber Eats and McDonald's report, receipt you ever submitted because of legislation and other things. And you might eventually get some money, but not quite as much because of those high interest rates. And you went down to the one house for sale on the block and you sort of said, look, you're the only person selling, I'm the only person buying. You're probably going to have to adjust your expectations for when, houses were getting bid up and it sort of, rocket high prices, but let's see if we can come to a deal. And eventually you would. It took about double the amount of time on the market. In more recent times, what you've been seeing is that you've got still that one person who's got limited numbers of money bags coming out of the bank. And they come along to the open home, they're like, look, I'm the only buyer who's coming through today. There's still not a lot of me. Either you give me your best price or there are 5 other houses on the street that will. So what are you going to do? I have a bit more. There's too much supply, excess supply, not enough demand, relatively speaking. Therefore, your price is going to go down, buddy. And that is what we're seeing. House prices are literally falling. So again, it has been nice as an economist to know that supply and demand do actually work. The other constraint, of course, well, you just say that because you're always like, okay, the model says, but like real life, please. You can see on this one as well, one of the real constraints on buyers at the moment is that although your house value might be lower, because you're paying still a relatively high over history house price relative to your income, and because you don't buy your house outright with cash, you don't save up 7 whole incomes over 7 years and spend nothing else and then buy it outright. You have to pay it with a mortgage. You can see here that the proportion of income you're having to spend on a mortgage out across the economy is at sort of record highs. In fact, for those of you who might have been like my grandfather and said, yes, Brad, but what about the 80s when interest rates were at 20%? Good question. We have run the numbers because I hated getting this question. Back in 1987, when interest rates were at about 20-odd%, the average New Zealand household was spending about 48% of the average household income to service the mortgage. Today, you're sort of spending about 51% or so. So it is actually wildly worse now at sort of 7% interest rates than it was at 20 or so. Let's talk now about the jobs market. It is challenging out there at the moment. You've seen, of course, the increases coming through in the unemployment rate. One of the big challenges we're seeing as well, though, is that, funnily enough, again, to fairly simple levels of supply and demand, at the moment, there is not as much work going around, and therefore businesses don't require as much labour. Therefore, the number of jobs out there on offer in the market has fallen quite substantially. In fact, the number of job ads out there on job sites, Seek, Trade Me and the likes, down at the lowest levels excluding the lockdown. So it's about 2013 or so. And so again, we're seeing a very difficult jobs market out there for people that are moving. And that has implications in a few other areas. Now, of course, we've seen the unemployment rate increase and we think that's still got a bit to go. The latest figure showed a 4.8% unemployment rate. And that was a little bit not quite as bad as we thought. Part of that, though, is because we're now seeing more people that are just becoming totally discouraged. In the September quarter, we saw 14,000 fewer New Zealanders in work Of those, only 5,000 were an increase in unemployment. The other 9,000 went elsewhere. They're not looking for jobs. They're not available for jobs. They're not keen. Some of them are going back into study, which is a fairly natural response that we see in the labour market. When it's a very good labour market and you can get heaps of money by just walking into a job, no one wants to go as much to university and similar or to Polytech. At the other end, when the jobs market gets tougher, you go and retrain and try and sort of set yourself apart a little bit more. The difficulty that we see at the moment is that the unemployment is very heavily concentrated amongst our young people. In fact, up until June, we saw that around about 2/3 of all of the increase in unemployment over the last year was concentrated in the under 30s. Which makes it also not too surprising that that group are now heading overseas. They're probably thinking of doing an OE at some point in the next 5 years or so, and sort of went, well, look, I was going to do it in a couple of years. Now there's not a job, there's not a great job prospect. I may as well go and have a bit of fun now, and then maybe try and find some money overseas, eventually come back as the job market starts to turn up. Now, the interesting thing with all of this, again, to my favourite supply and demand graphs, is that when you have a lot more people looking for jobs and not quite as many jobs available, you see quite a shift around in the likes of wage pressures. Now, we don't, of course, see wages go down, but what we have seen is go back sort of 2 years and people were willing to jump ship just about every day for an extra couple of dollars per hour in terms of payment. And that's because that was on offer. You know, you'd sit down and people were just offering some eye-watering amounts. As a business runner, you were going, I've got work to do. I desperately need someone. And that means that I'm going to have to put a good offer of wages on the table. That also meant that once I got that person in, I went, geez, as a business owner, now I have to figure out how I pay for this now. It's a more expensive resource. I might increase my charges. Oh, there goes a bit more inflation, and there goes potentially the wage price spiral that we're always worried about. Thankfully, it didn't happen. But as you can see here, that increase in unemployment has really quite sharply brought back just how many or how big the wage increases have been. And that is becoming a little bit more normal, where, again, those pay agreements that are coming out have been bigger in previous years, not so much in more recent times. We've, of course, seen also a bit of a shift in the way that people work. And one of the fun ones that certainly as a Gen Zer myself, sort of coming into the workforce, I'm not quite quitting quite yet, but we have seen a continued sort of shift in the level of working from home. And I guess I just highlight this because I think it is a big one, particularly for the next generation coming through, around how they're equipped to sort of work sustainably by themselves. That was certainly one of the rude shocks of coming through to universities. I went from having a fairly structured program where I got told what to do and got told off if I didn't, to sort of, you know, it's on you, and if you're going to stuff it up, then that's a good 10 grand down the hole every year until you buck up, which was good learning, not for me. I was fine. Everyone else, though, that I knew, questionable. You can see here, though, the level of working from home fairly sustained at about a third of the workforce. Back in 2006 and 2018, we didn't really know how many people worked from home, but those green bars indicate how many people should have been able to work from home. We don't know if they did or not, but that's how many sort of had the opportunity to. So you can see that sort of increase quite substantially over time. The other shift we've seen is a much larger number of twits out there in the economy. Now, I think a few of you will be sitting out there and going, yes, I know a few twits, I just can't name them all the time, which is possibly true, but not for the reasons you might think. That's because the twits are the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday workers. We have seen with that working from home shift, as you can see here, the biggest falls in public transport use in Auckland have been on Mondays and Fridays, because funnily enough, if you're going to work from home, a long weekend is your better opportunity. But it's just, it's I think, useful to start using some of the data that we've got out there in the economy to sort of make some fairly useful points. I mean, this is good. Everyone tells me, yes, of course, the roads are a bit easier to drive on Mondays and Fridays and that, but it's sort of nice, again, to sort of confirm some of those figures. We're seeing a shift, like I said before, in terms of the number of people coming into the country and heading out. Net migration is falling quite rapidly now as those arrivals figures come back. Again, not as much demand for foreign labour because we don't have as many job opportunities. We've got very few, and we've, of course, got more labour capacity here at home. But with that spare labour capacity that can't find its own job, the blue line, the number of departures is increasing. And in fact, you can see here it's the largest number of departures that we've ever seen on record. The challenging thing when we look through it is, again, we know why a lot of the younger people are going sort of in their 20s and 30s. Last year, though, we had around 11,000 people aged 0 to 9 who left the country. They are a little bit too young for the OE, and it does sort of show that, again, people are actually more permanently moving as entire family units, which does have implications because we've got a very low birth rate. And that means that over time, not immediately, but in sort of 20 to 30 years' time, there are going to be a lot of people that leave the workforce and not quite as many that come in. So unless we're all starting to use ChatGPT and similar to do our jobs, or are willing to do 3 times as much work, we're going to find ourselves in a very tricky situation. The world's also continually changing, and one of the things that has fascinated me the most this year is with the 40th anniversary at Infometrics is going back and looking at how the economic structure has shifted over time. This looks at GDP shares in 1984 through to 2024, and you can see just how massive those have been. The likes of manufacturing used to make up good sort of 22, 23% of GDP. It's now worth quite a lot less, below 10%. At the same time, business services, professional services, all of that has massively increased, going from just over 10% back in the 80s now through to over a quarter of all economic activity coming from that area. So 2 critical things there. 1, big shift. 2, you are very much helping support the bulk of the New Zealand economy into the future, the single largest proportion of economic activity. So thank you, I have to say there. We are, and this gets to the point where I wanted to make just briefly around how those sort of changes are coming through for the likes of the students that you'll be teaching and where they might be heading off to next. We are seeing some difficult times at the moment, again, because there's lower economic activity, because there's not as much demand for jobs and similar. And you can see here that our expectation for employment growth is sort of fairly horrible until sort of mid-2025. And the big sort of view there at the moment is that once interest rates come through and people actually have a bit more money in their back pocket, they will spend that more money, then business sales get better, then businesses need more people, and so on and so forth. Until that point, though, there's a lot of households out there going, look, I know if I can last through to next June, I get more money and I'm okay. But until that point, I'm worried that I get fired because unemployment is still rising. There's still not enough money in the economy for the number of jobs that might be there. If that's the case, even if I haven't yet been let go, I'm going to act a bit more like that as a household. I'm going to limit my spending. I'm going to keep a bit more in reserve. And so you can see it takes until that sort of second half of 2025 for employment growth to really start to spark up again. What does that mean, though, longer term? Because, again, we're going through a very unusual situation where we sort of went in 2019, the economy's in normal-ish economic zone. COVID hits, we lock down the economy, it can't work, the economy takes a dive. We get out of lockdown, we start to stimulate the economy like never before, and funnily enough, it responds, and so it sort of goes until it goes too high. We bring in higher interest rates to try and curb that high level of economic activity, and it's now done so, and we're trying to now find that Goldilocks zone. What we have done then is look out sort of at 2029 or so and gone, where will the jobs be relative to now? The biggest increase is in health, and the biggest primary driver of that is because we have an ageing population, and that requires more and more services over time. More older people who require more services, who live longer, will come through in that group the most. But it's that second group, what we call professional, scientific and technical services. That's where good old economists sit. That's where accounting, business analysts, consultancies and the likes sit as well. So again, really outside of that big demographic shift is that focus on what we do think of as highly skilled jobs. It is where that critical thinking comes into play. When I came through to the Victoria University of Wellington Open Day in 2014, it must have been, I sat down with the careers advisor and I said, I want to do a double degree. I want to do a Bachelor of Arts majoring in International Relations and Political Science and a Bachelor of Commerce majoring in Economics and Public Policy. And they said, awful idea. You can't do that much work. Do that in the first year, then pick 2 of your 4 majors that you actually want to continue with. And I nodded along vigorously and then completely like normal disregarded that advice and did all 4 for my entire degree. The reason I tell you that is not because I'm clearly bad with numbers and don't listen, but more importantly because doing that sort of conjoint degree meant that I got the good sort of theoretical and practical understanding here at the business school, but also got the critical thinking part that helped and still continues to help in the humanities space today around how do we sort of think about some of those complex issues for the world. So that professional, scientific and technical services is a huge part. If we don't get that, we don't get productivity growth in the country. We don't get development over time. We don't increase people's living standards and pay and what have you. So I'm quite glad to see that's still there, but it also is a bit of a rod for our own back that we do need to continue to push towards. A few business trends that, again, I think sort of gel in probably with the conversations that you were having earlier this morning, but also things that I think if you can push in your roles will ensure that we have a much stronger, much more forward-looking workforce into the future. And that's looking at the proportion of firms that are currently innovating in 2023. Now, the fact that not all of any of these bars are at 100% sort of concerns me. The reason I show you this is because we have seen time and time again that when economic downturns hit, we see young people get kicked out the quickest. If you're a business leader, you go, look, I could either kick someone out that's got 20 minutes experience or someone that's got 20 years. Which one do I keep? It's sort of a no-brainer. Except for the way that we're doing business these days is changing rapidly. Having to figure out how to use different technologies, how to innovate is more critical than ever before. And so I show you this because, one, a lot of businesses are innovating, and two, you're very much setting up people to innovate tomorrow. Why is it important? Well, because I've sort of been there firsthand when it comes to trying different things and thinking about those innovative solutions. This is going to sound a little bit old school, but back when we started, we headed into lockdown. As a firm, we were trying to write lots of economic notes. What's happening in the economy? How bad is it going to get? Is this the Great Depression 2.0? Things were changing so rapidly that by the time I drafted a note, sent it through to the chief forecaster, he signed it out, things had changed already, and so we couldn't actually issue it to clients. And so I went to the managing director one day on a Zoom call while I was sitting in my flat in Wellington on my ironing board because I didn't have a real desk. And I said to him, look, can I use my corporate credit card to buy a Zoom account so we can do webinars for clients? And he looked back at me on the screen and said, Brad, I understood less than half that sentence, but sure, go for it. What's the harm? That next day, we held a webinar for 400 of our clients, and that was 4 times as many clients we'd talked to in the last 4 years alone. It sort of just got me that, again, you know, it wasn't fancy, it wasn't particularly well polished. It was, again, from the ironing board, but it came through, and it was that sort of level of innovation that we're now starting to see more and more of. We're seeing as well today just how important using digital technology is as well, and in particular, and I won't ask anyone in the audience to provide their age, but it's always an interesting view how many people go either nod along or sort of look at me with a questioning look. Back in my parents' day, they tell me if they wanted to go out for a nice meal at a restaurant, they'd ask around, they'd get a good recommendation, and then they'd go. My generation, if I can't look at a menu online and figure out what I'm going to pre-order, I'm not going there. It could have the best reviews ever. I'm not going if I can't pre-order. So again, sort of how we use technology is important. Doesn't mean you'll have to get into TikTok videos, I promise. But thinking about sort of those innovative outcomes will be important to the economy in the future. The other one, the other sort of two that I wanted to profile, this chart looks at the proportion of work or the proportion of employees that businesses train in various things every year. Now, sort of thankfully, given that we have still some fairly poor health and safety results, health and safety trainings at the top. The two that I want to focus on the most, though, is the management skills there in the middle. You can see that it's sort of only a smaller proportion of people get management skills, both in terms of the bar there is not quite as long, but also the majority of the bar is a smaller proportion of the workforce in that business, only 1 to 25% of that workforce in any business there getting management and supervising skills. I'm not saying that that becomes the new thing that you teach in your classrooms, but again, that sort of element of leadership and management is something that we're quite woeful at in New Zealand. And the other one down the list a little bit more is computer skills. Now, I'm not going to lie, as someone, again, who now runs a business, if anyone comes into my business and can't use some of the basic tools, if they can't use Excel, they're probably not getting a look in the front door. When I went to high school, that wasn't something that we did a whole bunch of. And so I'm not sure where everyone is at the moment. I'm sort of hoping I'm preaching to the converted, but those sort of skills, how to use technology and similar, is really critical as we go forward. And sort of similar, you can see the proportions here with a lot of businesses now focusing on cloud computing. So again, how we're using technology is changing quite substantially. The one that worries me when we went through all of these figures on sort of business activity is how many people are using the web to order. Now, I've just told you how important it is, and that's true. You'll see here, though, that even in 2022, quite a few businesses were still not online there. And it does sort of speak to the fact that, again, we're seeing in some businesses quite a shift in terms of who has older workers, who have younger workers, who have a bit more of a mix in the middle, but a real sort of focus area there for us. I'm going to skip through this next one. This bit is one of my fun ones around spending, and again, comes a lot back to the likes of supply and demand, my favourite concept. But I think this makes it a bit real. After quite a bout of inflation, how do Kiwis actually spend their money? We've got, again, all of our models and similar, but this gives you a bit of an idea. For the first time ever in the 30-odd years that we've been tracking how New Zealanders spend their money, every single category saw an increase in spending in the couple of years through to 2023 compared to 2019. And that's not unusual, given that we have seen very high levels of inflation. But it is, I think, important to sort of see there the hierarchy of needs that people have. You put a roof over your head to start with, you feed yourself. The reason other expenditure is there is that's where interest payments sit as a proportion. And then you go down through the ranks. Insurance sits in miscellaneous, which is why it's so high. Education is at the bottom, not because we don't value it, but because it gets paid for by government a lot more than it gets paid for by households. So a little bit out there. But you can see the likes of alcohol, tobacco, drugs, communications, footwear and shoes, again, more of a want than a need. And so just again, I think interesting to sort of see those dynamics play out. When we look at food, because it is one of, again, my more favourite topics, you can see various levels of shift here. The biggest increase came through on grocery food. When we dug into that, that was around the likes of noodles and often particularly convenience foods. It is a real big trend across the country that we've seen that although people are still very keen, of course, to get their veggies and their fresh meats and similar, convenience is now a much more important option to a lot of households. So just an interesting trend. One that I will give you, though, you'll see that there was a very minor adjustment in the likes of meat, poultry and fish. Now, I'm going to try crowd participation. We'll see how this goes. How many of you are in your classroom, sort of straight up economics teachers in the room? Hands up, please. How many of you have given you an example at some point in your career around the likes of inferior and normal goods and the move from mince to steak is the example I got taught. Is that what's still sometimes used? The fascinating thing is that when I've looked into the detailed data for the first time ever, we've gone back towards mince. We've moved away from steak and gone back towards mince in the last 4 years or so because of the pricing element. So fun fact that you can use there, it is still very much an inferior normal good relationship. It's just that sometimes when the old budget gets a bit stretched, you have to push back the other way. And then you can see that just lastly with a bit of a shift in the relativity. So proportional wise, the percentage point change, biggest increase coming through on food. As a household, I value that the most. Other expenditure there with my interest rates is the next biggest thing that I put my shift in money towards, and then miscellaneous with the likes of insurance. And then the other stuff, funnily enough, rec and creative and culture, don't care as much about, don't need to go and be quite as fun because I've got sort of life to live. So again, interesting how you sort of see that play out. Now, I said I'd give you a few examples to steal, and I sort of would recommend, well, feel free to steal them because, again, these are the ones that always, I think, get the most interest here. Inflation, of course, is very difficult when you put, the likes of an index up on a chart and you have to talk about how you have to adjust the price of phones and how stuff's changed over time. Here is my very simple example of inflation. 2-minute noodles. Everyone knows what 2-minute noodles is. Now, this is even better because I'm presenting here at a university, and let me tell you that when people get to university, this is a staple item. And you can see there, this is just straight up prices. You can see back in 2011 or so, you paid about $2.50 in the supermarket for the cheapest 5-pack of 2-minute noodles. And it then basically stayed around that price. In fact, it even got a bit better up until inflation really started to get going. And then in more recent times, it started to curve out again. If you've never seen if you've seen a better example of inflation trends, please let me know because I'm happy to replace it. But I think that's pretty on when it comes to those ones. The other one, again, from trying to sort of describe the supply and demand piece with sort of a few more specific examples is everyone's luxury necessity, the chocolate bar. You can see increases in the chocolate bar price over time. It's sort of hovering around at the moment because every now and then you get a good special at the supermarket and Stats picks up only the cheapest price. But you can see that it has sort of trended higher over time. That's because cocoa production across the world is now the lowest in 8 years. And so funnily enough, demand hasn't changed. If anything, it's probably gone up. But production is now quite a bit lower. And so again, we've now seen that the price of cocoa on the international market is triple what it was a couple of years ago. An even more stark example, now I'll give you that because everyone likes chocolate and it's very relatable. But how many of you have bought olive oil in the last couple of weeks? How any of you made it here today and, you had to choose one oil and you chose olive oil and not real oil sort of gets me. But You can see very much there the sharp increase in olive oil prices again over the last sort of year and a bit. And again, very much to demand and supply. Here is the amount of olive oil produced in the global economy, or at least in the EU, which is a major producer. And so again, you can sort of see very clearly that increasing or sustained level of demand, decreasing supply means that your price has adjusted quite substantially. More than happy to send the slides out as well afterwards. I just sort of thought, geez, if someone had showed me this back at high school, I reckon I would have got it. I got it eventually, don't get me wrong. My economics teacher was fantastic, Mr. Bloggs at Whangarei Boys High, but these, I think, might well be helpful. Right, the last couple that I want to discuss with you very, very briefly, and then I'll turn it to questions, I promise, is around those greener shoots. Normally in the economics game, you can never get an economist happy. We've always got something we want to moan about next. And so I've tried to change my presentations around to end on a little bit more of a high note. We know that unlike almost any other time in New Zealand's economic history, we're primed now for a better economic trend. Back, if you look at the likes of the GFC, people didn't know that interest rates were going to come down. They weren't aware that an economic shock was going to hit, so they weren't thinking about that and sort of ready to spend again. This time we knew it was going to happen. We got told that there was going to be a recession. We got told that interest rates were going to be higher. And we were told that once we got rid of inflation, things would start to calm down. And people are now responding like that. You can see on this chart that around sort of 30-40% of new lending and refixing on the mortgage book has been fixed for just 6-month rates. People are primed. They know that they will get lower interest rates soon, so they're sort of moving towards that. That means two important things. Firstly, we're a bit more ready for that better economic time to come. Normally, we'd say it sort of takes 12 to 18 months for monetary policy to work for those better economic times to come through. Because we're ready for it this time, it might just take those more 6 to 9 months, which is why we think mid-2025 is when things start to perk up a bit more. The second, just because everyone's going short doesn't mean it's necessarily the best option. And as I said before, not personal advice, but worthwhile looking at the differences there, because last time I looked, the 1-year fixed interest rate was actually quite a bit lower than the 6-month, even though you get to refix on it on the second one sooner. So again, some trends. And the biggest one for me, probably the most important economic indicator out there, it's not GDP, because gosh, we'd be here forever trying to explain it, is money. If you and I and everyone else there have money in our wallets and we're willing to take it out and spend it, then the economy is starting to do okay. If we're not, it suggests that either we don't have money because we don't have a job, or we do have money and we're too scared about the economy to actually spend it. And so the fact that you've started to see that little bit of a curve up in spending activity, this looks at monthly card spending. It's not huge, still down on a year ago, still a depressed economic environment, but a little bit of a trend change does suggest that we're starting to see those early signs. There is light at the end of the economic tunnel. It's a slightly longer tunnel than we hoped for, but it is genuine sunlight this time rather than another train coming down the tracks. With that, I'll turn off the economic foghorn. I'm going to take a breath for a moment. I hope you all will too, but more than happy to take any and all questions. Thank you very much. The increase you're seeing in youth unemployment is purely because of that piece where businesses are going, look, I have to make a tough choice around who I keep, and it's generally last in, first out. I mean, and that has, like I say, very unfortunately, but it's been the way it's always been. What is, I think, exacerbating that a bit more is that during the pandemic, you had, and I expect some of you will have experienced this yourself, you had a lot of young people sort of on the cusp in sort of 16, 17, 18 age group who were going, look, I could stay at school and I might not particularly like it all that much. So I might be sort of, a moderate student. Or I could go out and get some pretty serious money out in the economy because people were willing to pay big. We didn't have migration coming in, and so that normal migration gap had to be filled by, often, and it was younger workers. We saw youth employment at that point for like the 15 to 19 age group increase by like 10, 12% over the last couple of years. That group then is the first one that starts to get biffed out when businesses don't need as many people, and importantly, as migration comes back in, and then businesses have a choice. Do I get someone who's got some skills from overseas or someone who has no skills and is available? I used to take the one that was available because they were here and no one else was. Now I've got more choice. So that is coming through a lot more. We are certainly hearing from a few more business people that they are trying to keep their young people on board. And I think the difference at the moment is that the smart businesses, those who have gone, geez, it was really difficult to hire the last couple of years, I've really struggled to try and bring people in. Now, if I let people go, I'm going to find myself in 2 years' time desperately trying to hire them back, and they're not going to be there. So I'm actually trying to secure my supply chain because the labour market is sort of a longer term burn. But for a lot of other businesses, they're going, look, I don't want to get rid of people, but just quite simply, I had this many people to do this much work. Now I've got this much work and that many people, I've got to trim it back a bit. I'm not going to lie, and this is with casting no shade to those who signed the letter. I feel like calling it a bunch of economists is there are no bank economists. There's one, I think, maybe two private sector economists. I would call it more sort of an academic economics group. And that's not casting any shade. It's just that I feel like if you had like one teacher and a whole bunch of other people and they said it was a teachers group, you'd probably equally go, that's a bit on the nose. Anyway, look, there are quite clearly political views on that in terms of the right level of spending and similar. I would fall, and I feel this is really orthodox economics, that you don't want to try and overstimulate the economy, and that although it might not have directly been why inflation got higher, high levels of government spending had meant the last couple of years that you had quite a lot of money that was purely fueling higher prices, particularly for wages across the economy, than actually delivering a whole lot of productive stuff. Also means, and I think this is probably almost more my worry, and the reason that I don't support the particular letter, and I do broadly support the thrust of how the government is thinking to limit its spending, although not always the way and manner that they might be doing it, is that you want generally the economy the government to be acting sort of counter-cyclical. When the private sector is going great guns and doing a lot of building and doing a lot of investment, doing a lot of business activity, government doesn't need to prop up the economy. All it's going to do then is rebadge other economic activity. It's going to displace, and it's going to lead to price increases. When the economy comes off the boil, when the private sector can't invest, is when the government should push ahead. And so sort of a classic example of that at the moment is the construction market. The number of building consents in the economy got about 10-20% higher than the actual building sector could cope with. And so everyone paid huge amounts more for their buildings across the country. Now, Kāinga Ora and the government don't have as much money because they spent all of their money over the last couple of years. They haven't got as much now, so they can't actually sort of lean in against it. So I would rather that we sort of try and balance it out so that government can spend a bit more in the leaner economic times. But I think also this is a consequence of really borrowing 5 years worth of money in 1 year in COVID, and at some point you've got to pay that back. Either you keep sort of taking out a mortgage on your mortgage on a mortgage, or you have to sort of trim it back. I must say, I think the challenge though, and you see this particularly in Wellington, where there's been a lot of cutbacks, of course, in the public sector and a lot of other areas, and now people are going, well, you know, I've lost services. What I think I would have almost rather have seen from government, instead of sort of everyone gets a 6 or 7% across the board cut, is government go, here are my top 10 priorities. Let's resource those top 10 priorities appropriately. And I'm sorry, if you're not in the top 10 list, then you don't get as much resource and you might have to trim it back. But what you're seeing now is the government trying to plough ahead with a number of initiatives and then finding they might not have as much resource because they've sort of had a trim across the board. So again, being a bit more strategic about it, a little bit more surgical than sledgehammer would be helpful. But as a country, we've spent quite a considerable amount more proportionally as a percentage of GDP in previous times. We haven't necessarily got the right results from it. So I'm okay with us limiting back the spending, but there is a Goldilocks zone. I think that's sort of the point. We went from probably too low to at one point very high, and now we're trying to find somewhere else in the middle. Both of those questions, and I say this because at an aggregate level, if you don't get this sector working and doing better, the rest don't really matter all that much, is the primary sector, agri-tech and what have you. It's just such a big part of what we do. You couldn't replace it easily overnight. You couldn't replace all of the jobs, the export, the money that goes into it. But we can get some productivity gains over time. And if you do that, then you get sort of wider gains because then we could export some of that technology and similar. But it is stuff across the board. I think probably depends a little bit on what part of the productivity picture we look at. Like Rocket Lab and some of that advanced rocketry and sort of which sits both in the manufacturing and engineering sort of space, huge potential, but also sort of you're not going to replace an entire sector of the New Zealand economy with that immediately. Like that will be a longer burn. But you look at other things, the likes of, to that point, if you don't have good education, if we're not having people that can do their times tables, we're not going to generate a lot of rocket scientists. So like that's fairly critical on how we support people through the education system there. But you look at the other area that I often look at is construction. We're actually less productive now on construction than we were 30, 40 years ago. And I do think that a large part of that is because we want to do everything custom. You look at, for example, any of you from Dunedin or down? No, you're all from, oh, there is someone. So like Dunedin Hospital, I think, is a very good yet very challenging example. Why have we over the last 40 years not come up with the New Zealand hospital build blueprint and gone, you know what, chuck one there. We need one in Whangarei, chuck one there. We need one in Tauranga, chuck one there. No, it has to be bespoke, which means we spend an inordinate amount of money on all of these different designs. And then when they don't pan out, we spend a bit more money trying to fix it and what have you. Same with school builds, same with the likes of even roads and similar. You look at the likes of State Highway 25A, the reason that got banged up on budget and on time, in fact, ahead of time, is because they stole a bridge from another site and took it there and said, we're going to bang that one up. Like some of that productivity stuff is looking at it and going, how do we actually sort of make this streamlined? Because we seem to make a lot of complexity for ourselves we might need to. That's why, sort of to my point before, don't try and recreate those graphs. Email me, steal them. Like, I don't care. I'd rather you use them and make it useful than you sort of spend your time trying to recreate them, because I sort of feel like as a country, we need to figure out how we can legitimately and legally rip off the good stuff and make it context dependent for us, but like results in that now. So the latest inflation for Q3, September quarter, was 2.2. So we're back in the band. We're very, very close to back in the band. Well, very close to the midpoint. We're back in the band. Core inflation is falling in as well, so I think that's encouraging. The worry, I think, is that we're starting to see across the world, and you see this particularly in the US, for example, that once we sort of lose what we call price discipline, it can take a bit of time to bring that back. And I guess to that point before that I was making around wage rates and similar, there is a worry, I guess, that because for the longest time, no one was willing to put up prices. For the decade after the GFC, every business in town, New Zealand, Australia, the world, sort of went, if I up my prices, then the competitor down the road is going to undercut me by not changing their prices, and they'll get my business. So I'm going to try and hold the line. Whereas through the pandemic, people went, you know what? I was budgeting for a 5% increase in my costs this year, but I got 10. So I'm already 5% down. Next year, I was thinking it might be another 10%, but I'm 5% down. So that's now a 15% gap I need to raise through. And I got inflation wrong last year, so I'll add an extra 5% on top of that. So I'm now at 20, and maybe because I'm worried about future inflation, I'll just add a little bit in ahead of time so you get 25. So businesses sort of went from being very disciplined on pricing to very not. And so I think what you're starting to see now is just that worry from the Reserve Bank over how quickly they can bring interest rates down. It's clear that they're happier to go faster because there's not as much inflationary pressure in the economy, and that they think that there's obviously quite a bit of weakness. So they're trying to sort of go faster with your 50 basis points. We had been wondering whether they might go 75 in the November meeting next week. We think that's sort of a little bit off the table just because some of the data hasn't been like as egregiously bad as we thought it might have been. You know, if the economy really was cratering, then, you know, there'd be calls for doing more. The big question, I think, is that all of this exists in sort of a backwards looking frame. The latest inflation data we have is really from about 3 months ago at this point. A lot of the spending data we've got is a couple of months old. So we're trying to make sort of future decisions for what might affect the economy in 12 months' time based on data that we had 3 months ago. So there's a little bit of what we call the coordination problem of trying to marry that all together. Long story short, we've got enough information at the moment that the New Zealand economy is weaker. It's not generating as much inflation, therefore we can bring interest rates down. But to that graph I showed towards the start, we're not bringing them down to ultra low levels and trying to stimulate the economy. We're just trying to sort of take our foot off the brake. So it's not an accelerator, but it's less brake that we're trying to apply. Data, funnily enough, to get, and this is one of the frustrations with New Zealand data and a lot of data around the world, very good levels of average numbers and sort of, high level aggregates, trying to figure out the distribution of anything, of spending, of, housing outcomes or whatever, very difficult because we sort of have to get some fairly expensive surveys. And as you'll probably all remember, the last time we did a census back in 2018, it didn't work out so well. 2023 was better, but it does just mean that distribution stuff is a bit more difficult. In general, and this is, you're going to, I suspect, laugh, but this is correct. When about halfway through the pandemic, Treasury did an update of New Zealand's sort of income distribution estimates. And one thing that came through was that New Zealand had actually become less unequal than before, which seemed very wild when people's house prices had massively increased and a whole bunch of people couldn't buy. What it was you had three groups in society on this model, to try and simplify an entire paper into a few seconds. You had a bunch of renters, you had a bunch of homeowners, and then at the end you had a bunch of really, really wealthy people who had a few homes, but also just lots of wealth in like stocks and stuff. The renters didn't change. They didn't really go anywhere. They didn't sort of have a massive increase. They didn't have a massive decrease. Your group in the middle who had houses, their houses got more expensive, so their wealth increased, and so they became closer. The middle point of that second group became closer to where the really wealthy people were. So technically on the distribution, you had no change in the people hardest hit in society, but the sort of pretty well off and the very well off became ever so slightly closer. So inequality went ever so slightly down. That's the very broad shift of it. I think the worry that we're seeing at the moment is that there are still a number of people in society. You look at the likes of the housing register, the number of people looking for state housing, you look at the number of people going to food banks, the number of people on benefits, all of those figures are increasing. So I think that's why as well, in a lot of this economic data, there's almost never a time that I get a question like this one where I can go, you know what, here's a spreadsheet and exactly here's your answer. It is normally a sort of a level of triangulation of how can I find a few data points that try and push us towards the right area. So on the whole, I think we're still in a pretty good space, particularly relative to other countries. You know, New Zealand is still a fairly good place to grow. Not saying that we're without our issues though, and I think that's the issue, is that those who are down in the most challenging parts of society in terms of their income, in terms of particularly their housing situation, that's where the issues come from. MSD does a very good report every year or two where they look at some of these figures, and the thing that always strikes me with that is that there's only really one metric you need to care about. It's not food prices, it's not the cost of fuel, it's not anything else, it's housing, almost pure and simple. How people's rental costs go, how people's income relative to the likes of mortgage payments go is the biggest determinant of whether or not they've got money left at the end of the week. So solve housing, and I'm genuinely more upbeat about housing at the moment. The home ownership rate increased for the first time since the 90s last year. Sort that one out, and I think we're on our way to a better society overall.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you all.